to suffer.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, the Prime Minister led a Canadian delegation to Florida to meet with President Trump. They had a productive discussion on border and economic security, including the impacts tariffs will have on both Canadian and American consumers. In 2018, it was this government that renegotiated NAFTA, which led to record trade just last year of $1.3 trillion, Mr. Speaker. As we have done through 3 American administrations, we will continue to stand up for Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, once again this morning we found out that yet another sawmill is closing. Rapide des Joachim sawmill in Pontiac is the latest to get a taste of the weakness of this Liberal government. 10% of the town's workforce will lose their jobs. The economic repercussions for the town will be catastrophic. The threat of becoming a ghost town hangs over the village, just as it did in Sacré-Cœur in my region with the Caribou Decree. Why didn't the Prime Minister come back from Mar-a-Lago with any gains for forestry workers? When are we going to have an election?
Development and international trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member through you for that very important question. Mr. Speaker, the softwood lumber industry is very important to our government. We know it represents thousands of jobs from British Columbia down to Quebec, down to Eastern Canada. We will always stand up for Canadian softwood lumber. We stood up for Canada when the U.S. imposed aluminum and steel tariffs on us. And what did the Conservatives? They asked us to capitulate and back down. We have a proven track record to negotiate good trade deals. We will always stand up for lumber workers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, 23 workers have been laid off. And how many other indirect jobs depend on the factory in a village of just 188 residents? The threat of becoming a ghost town is very real. This is all because of the Liberal government's failure to reach an agreement on softwood lumber. This is the 4th sawmill in Quebec to announce its closure in just a few months. Our workers need a strong leader. When will we have an election so that we can elect the Conservative leader to be Prime Minister? The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Coast Guard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're very disappointed that the American Department of Trade increased unfair, unjustified duties on Canadian softwood lumber. This is incredibly unfair and it is harmful to both producers and consumers on both sides of the border. Canadian workers are being punished by unfair tariffs, and this will also harm American lumber companies. The United States Department has to find a good, lasting solution, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, last week, on behalf of the Bloc Québécois, I tabled a bill that, if passed, would contribute significantly to the fight against organized crime. Not only would our bill create a list of criminal organizations, but it would also hit the bullseye by requiring members of these organizations to prove that their assets are not proceeds of their criminal activities. This would effectively reverse the burden of proof. This would send a clear message to criminals, Mr. Speaker. Will the government take up our bill and start taking the fight against organized crime seriously? The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate this question because it addresses a very serious matter. Organized crime has increased here in Canada. What we are experiencing is that we need to address the situation. We made changes through Budget 2024 and the 2023 Fall Economic Statement for funding of organized crime. We also took action on car theft by investing more at the borders, and so car thefts have decreased by 40% in Quebec. Those are the results that this side of the House is delivering. The Honourable Member for Rivière-du-Nord. Mr. Speaker, gang wars are on our streets. Gangs put bounties on journalists. They kill innocent people by setting fire to businesses. They even shoot each other in broad daylight. They even take each other out in federal prisons. And what's the government doing? Where is the government? The government is doing nothing, and it is nowhere. The Liberals could send a strong message to gangsters and pass our bill, but no. While they're Dilly-dallying, the gangs continue to lay down the law and bring their wars to our streets. When will the government start taking the fight against organized crime seriously?
L'honorable ministre de la Justice.
The Honourable Minister of Justice and Attorney General. When we have conferences and meetings with our counterparts, including Ministers Bonnardel and Jolin Barrette, we talk about investments. We have invested $132 million in our Guns and Gangs initiative, which especially helps Quebec. We also invested $42 million to make our communities safer. Through our investments, we have made significant efforts and we have succeeded in reducing organized crime-related incidents such as car thefts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Caledon.
I agree with the NDP leader who said the Liberal government will always step in to make sure unions have no power. The minister's Section 107 referrals took away workers' rights to strike. As a result of this, Conservatives believe that this Liberal government has lost the confidence of the House of Commons. Now, this puts the NDP and the NDP leader in a tough spot. Will he support his own words, support workers, or continue to prop up this NDP Liberal government, or will the government throw their coalition buddy a line and call a carbon tax election?
Order. Order. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, you would think this was not from the party that supported the anti-union oppressive Bill C-377 and Bill C-525. You would think this wasn't from the party who has in its own policy handbook the fact that they will be bringing in right-to-work Alabama-style legislation into this House. You would think that that wasn't the party that refused to debate that very motion this morning in this House of Commons.
Order. The Honourable Member from Dufferin-Caledon.
So his defense of his decision to take away a worker's right to strike is to talk about some things from a few years ago. Unions have unilaterally condemned the Section 107 referrals, and the NDP leader said he intervenes to take away unions' power. That's true. He took away the Teamsters' right to strike. He took away the ILWU's 514's right to strike. But when Unifor 1541 asked him to intervene to prevent union busting, this minister disappears. But the leader of the NDP has a choice to make. Will they keep propping up these guys that make these anti-worker decisions, or will he stand with his words and vote against?
I'm going to ask all members, please, to remind themselves that they have to keep their voices down so that those who participate using translation can hear the interpretation. The Honourable Minister of Labour and for Seniors.
You would think that wasn't the party that opposed 10 sick days for employees in federally regulated industries. You would think that that was a party that didn't have right-to-work Mississippi-style legislation in its policy platform. You would think that wasn't the party whose very leader decried the involvement of unions in the procurement and other processes. Mr. Speaker, this Conservative Party is anti-worker. They've proved it on every single occasion that they're able to do it, and we will always stand for workers in this country.
The Honourable Member from Peterborough-Kawartha.
Today, the truth will be revealed. The Conservatives have put forward a non-confidence motion using the quote from the NDP leader where he said the Prime Minister is greedy and anti-worker. So what will it be? Will the leader of the NDP sell out Canadians yet again, or has that Prime Minister made another backroom deal that puts both of their lust for power over the rights of Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Seniors and for Labour.
I guess that member's back from announcing the housing projects in her riding that she voted against in this House of Commons. It is a joke. Mr. Speaker, it is a sick joke to watch these Conservatives line up behind this leader and his fake, false bravado, putting motions on the floor of this House. Then we ask them to debate those very motions. What do they say? No, Mr. Speaker. They refuse to debate their own motion. They will not debate help for Canadians. They will not debate tax cuts. They will not debate any support for Canadians in this House of Commons. This is a sick joke.
Order. Order. L'ordre, s'il vous plaît.
Order, please.
Order. L'honorable député de Châteauguay-Lac.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, the global pandemic made things difficult for the hospitality industry, the tourism industry, and many of our retailers and restaurants too. Through programs like the Canada Emergency Business Account, our government stepped up to help businesses through that difficult time. Now, my constituents want to know what we're doing to help them post-recovery. Can the Minister for the Environment and Climate Change tell us about the government's plan?
L'honorable
The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. I thank my colleague for her question. We're always there for Canadian families and Canadian businesses in good times and in bad times. Twice, though, we proposed tax cuts for the middle class, and on both occasions, the Conservative leader voted against the tax cuts and forced his party to join him in doing so. Today, with our GST cut, we are providing even more support for families and businesses. You'd think that the Conservatives would support this, but the only tax cuts they seem to support are for their rich friends and for big oil companies. It's always the same old story for the Conservative Party. Their interests and their friends' interests first, the interests of Canadians second.
for Calgary Forest Lawn.
The Auditor General exposed $3.5 billion for ineligible CEBA loans thanks to this incompetent Liberal NDP government. They were too incompetent to run this program themselves, so they gave a sole source contract to Accenture, a multinational corporation that gave most of the work to Brazilians, not Canadians. Canadians got taken to the cleaners for more than $300 million. Why are third-party contractors running this government and covering up ministers' incompetence?
Here, here. Good job. Good job.
The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, it's nice to know that there exists a report that the opposition can read without a security clearance. The member opposite and his party claim every single time that they care about small businesses, when in fact every single time we put efforts and support forward for small businesses, they always vote against it and decline everything that we do. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the CEBA loans were there and helped nearly 900,000 small businesses keep their lights on, keep their doors open, and keep their employees working. We will continue to be there to support small business, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mission Mashpee Fraser Canyon.
Mr. Speaker, today the Auditor General released a bombshell report on the Canada Emergency Business Account. It highlights serious inefficiencies, a lack of government oversight, and $3.5 billion in losses to ineligible recipients. So how did we get here? The report outlined that the third-party program administrator, Accenture, set their own pricing, wrote their own contracts, ran procurement, and received 19 uncompetitive contracts for $313 million. Why can't the Liberals administer a government program without breaking a conflict of interest law?
Here, here.
The Honourable Minister for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises.
Mr. Speaker, I already talked about the fact that there exists a report that they can read that they don't need security clearance for. So here's the real bombshell, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to security clearance, there are more allegations that have come forward with regards to foreign interference in the Conservative Leadership Party race. Yet the Conservative leader chooses to ignore these security breaches in his own party. If the Conservative leader actually cared, he'd have nothing to hide. So, Mr. Speaker, can the leader of the Conservative Party get the clearance, take the briefing, and protect this country?
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General came down hard on Liberal corruption this morning. She revealed that $3.5 billion from the Canada Emergency Business Account was paid to companies that were ineligible. Worse yet, as in this case of the ArriveCan scandal, it was a private company, in this case Accenture, which established the criteria and costs of its own contract with the government. Mr. Speaker, why are the Ministers of Finance and Foreign Affairs continuing to illegally reward a private company at the expense of Canada's hard-hit small and medium enterprises? The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Economic Development. The Economic Development Agency, rather. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will repeat some of what my colleagues have said earlier. Just in case the colleague didn't hear the interpretation earlier, we're glad that the party is able to read through a report that they don't need a security clearance for. It's a public document that is available to the public. Now, there are thousands of businesses from coast to coast to coast that would not have survived the pandemic without our government's support. That's what we're here for. We're here to ensure that businesses can pay their employees, pay their expenses, and that they were able to remain resilient throughout the most significant pandemic in history.
Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, we're in the midst of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. This campaign unites people across the country and the world to call out and speak up against acts of gender-based violence. Unlike the Conservative Party, our government has never wavered in supporting survivors of gender-based violence or investing in prevention. Could the Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Youth update the House on our government's commitment to addressing this crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Our theme, Come Together, Act Now, Mr. Speaker, emphasizes that everyone plays a part, especially men and boys, to change attitudes and behaviors that contribute to gender-based violence. And this dangerous behavior is pervasive. Even the leader of the Conservative Party embedded misogynistic hashtags in his YouTube videos. Canadian women remember, Mr. Speaker. Our government won't ever back down on supporting survivors. We created the first national action plan to end gender-based violence, backed by more than $500 million. We will not relent until every woman is safe.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples continue to be killed by the RCMP. In less than a month, 9 Indigenous peoples were killed without consequence. The RCMP and provincial authorities must respond towards reconciliation. Indigenous peoples deserve justice. Victims and their families deserve justice. When will this government finally work with Indigenous peoples and law enforcement towards Indigenous justice?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, we thank our colleague for that important question and obviously share her concern and the concern of all Canadians when we see these tragic outcomes. I've talked to the RCMP, the Commissioner, the leadership of the RCMP about this. I've had a chance to talk to Indigenous leaders and territorial premiers about this. We share our colleagues' concern about moving towards a circumstance where we can have more Indigenous police forces and include Indigenous communities in the important law enforcement that Canadians expect in their communities and that we want to do in partnership with them. And we'll continue to do that important work, Mr. Speaker, and think of the families of these victims at all times.
The Honourable Member for Spadina Fort York.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's border and immigration are key issues for the incoming Trump administration. It's no surprise the immigration minister was left out of the Prime Minister's Mar-a-Lago visit, given that it's his failures that have now placed our economy at risk. With IRGC agents hiding behind the refugee program to avoid deportation, can the public safety minister, who did make the trip and whose department finally got around to designating the IRGC as a terrorist that they are, share what he's doing to kick out every single terrorist from Canada? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for Citizenship, Immigration and Refugees.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we see a member of the House constantly making things up. We are very, very concerned about any foreign agent working in Canada, whether it's as part of any purported terror. The enforcement agencies in our country work diligently to clamp down on these people, to arrest them, to bring them to justice, or to kick them out of the country. We'll continue to do so. Thank you.
Je voudrais signaler aux députés la présence et la...
I would like to highlight the presence of a former colleague, the Honourable Jean-Claude Damour, former Minister of Government Affairs, Minister for Immigration and Minister for Military Affairs for the province of New Brunswick.
I see that there are 2 points of order which are going to be raised. The Honourable Member from Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to add my perspective on the matter of privilege raised on Friday by my colleague, the member for London Frencha. Specifically, the opposition Deputy House Leader explicitly named me and put completely false information on the record regarding my conduct in the lobby as an attempt to deflect from the deliberate, premeditated plan to disrupt the voting proceedings in the House. And so I'm rising to state this, to correct the record and put on the record what had actually happened. Prior to the vote taking place, on my way to the washroom, I overheard the Conservative lobby staff instruct Conservative MPs to disrupt proceedings in the chamber once the NDP rose to vote. He then egged them on and said, quote, "The NDP deserves it." I shook my head and made a comment under my breath and left the lobby. Not only was there no intimidation, there was no heated exchange of words between me and that staffer. In other words, the Conservative staff is suggesting that the NDP deserves to have our House privilege violated in clear contravention of Section 16(1) of the Standing Orders. When the vote took place, sure enough, the Conservatives carry out their premeditated plan to deliberately violate the privilege of NDP members. During the vote, I was not able to hear if my vote was registered, and I did not know if, in fact, it had or not. I stood for some time watching and waited. After the vote, a number of MPs and staff had gathered, and I reiterated that the staffer in question had instructed Conservative MPs to disrupt the House, which he affirmed. I also raised this with the Conservative whip and asked if this amounted to bullying, to which he responded that he knew nothing about it. The question is, if he knew nothing about it, then who instructed the Conservative lobby whip staff to disrupt the House? Is it the leader of the official opposition? If not, did the staff act on their own? I understand what happens in the lobby is not subject to debate in the House, but the member from Megantic-Larab brought this up, and I need to defend myself and put the truth on the record. The member's fabrication does not end there. In his comment, he says that an NDP staffer had to, quote, physically take hold of me. Not only is this absolutely untrue, when I returned from the washroom and walked through the lobby, I was not manhandled, by anyone. On the contrary, I proactively informed what I had overheard to the NDP lobby staff, who was already aware at the time that the Conservatives intended to violate Standing Order 16.1 by disrupting the House when the NDP got up to vote. This was reported to the clerk, and so that the Speaker would be informed and aware. It is so deeply disturbing for the Conservatives to resort to fabricating such a story to malign me and the NDP hardworking staff. So, Mr. Speaker, not only are the members' comments completely untrue, but I think as you deliberate, you should be aware of the premeditation and intentional nature of the disruption of Section 16.1 of the Standing Orders brought on by the Conservative MPs on Thursday, Mr. Speaker. The truth needs to be told, and I hope that this information will assist you in that deliberation.
I thank the honourable member from Vancouver East. Je reconnais un rappel.
Point of order. The second person on the list was the honourable member for La Prairie. Yes, thank you, but it's not on the same topic, but I'll still go ahead with my point of order. One of your responsibilities is to maintain order in this House. I know it's not always easy, especially at this time. I know our friends at the NDP are very far away from you, but they're very near us, and they're often very noisy, and it's hard to hear interpretation, and it is also disruptive for us. So I hope that in future you'll be able to pay greater attention to what's happening in this corner of the House, because it's really hard for us.
Je remercie l'honorable député de La Prairie pour son intervention.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for his intervention. Third point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to reserve the right to come back to this question with a more comprehensive response, but I couldn't help but stand up and respond to a few of the erroneous points that the NDP member just raised. And I want to thank my colleague from the Bloc Québécois to point out that the NDP are often selective in their sanctimony about decorum in this place. They are often extremely noisy, heckle members when they have the floor, including during votes, Mr. Speaker. So they suddenly find their holier than thou-ness genes on this type of thing when they themselves are guilty of it often. With regards to the specific allegations, I can tell the NDP member that there are witnesses that saw everything that our colleagues have pointed out, including we have videotape of the erratic and unhinged behavior that the NDP members exhibited when they marched up to the Speaker's chair. She wants to talk about decorum. Marching up to the Speaker's chair, hurling insults at the Speaker after the House had already been adjourned, to the point where they did have to be taken aback because they were violating the space of members of our side who mostly were seated and calm and collected. And I don't know what happened to cause such erratic and unhinged behavior in the part of the NDP. I won't speculate to that, but I will be coming back with a more substantive response, including the eyewitness testimony of members who were in the lobby who heard that member hurl abuse and profane and vulgar language at a staffer. So an elected MP yelling insults and using profane language against a staffer would also rise to the level of unparliamentary behavior. As she pointed out, it happened in the lobby, not in the chamber. But I would just point out that it's your job, Mr. Speaker, to enforce decorum during votes and during speeches, which you did that night. You made a judgment call on aspects of decorum that evening. And other than that, I believe that's where the matter should rest. And it was only after the NDP started making false and defamatory accusations, which I dare say they would never repeat outside the chamber, that we were forced to show Canadians the actual truth about what happened that evening, which consisted of NDP members of Parliament completely losing their cool, coming over in an aggressive and hostile manner, hurling abuse and yelling at members who are seated and calm and collected. That is the true story about what happened that night, and we will absolutely correct the record.
I see that the honourable member from Niagara Centre is rising, Niagara Falls rather, is rising on The same point of order? If I could ask the honourable member to be brief.
And I take no pleasure in standing here, and I'm just building on what our House Leader would have to say in the report that he will be coming back with on further comments. I was one of those witnesses that evening in the lobby, and you know I want to correct or bring a little clarification to what the member opposite said. Unfortunately, she used her position of power to bully a staffer and used inappropriate language when dealing with that one staffer. I immediately let the whip's office and our House Leader's office know, and it should not stand. You do not treat the people that serve us here in this House in that type of manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I hope to come back to the House as soon as possible after we've heard the interventions, which some have indicated that they're going to be coming back to the House with before the Speaker makes some observations. I wish to inform the House that the volume of earpieces will now be reset.
I wish to inform the House that the volume of earpieces will now be reset.
Routine business, tabling of documents, introduction of government bills, statements by ministers, reports from interparliamentary delegations, presenting reports from committee. The honourable member for Charlottetown.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai l'honneur de présenter dans les deux
Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to present in both official languages the 22nd report of the Standing Committee on Health about Bill C-368, an act to amend the Food and Drugs Act, Natural Health Products.
has studied the bill and has decided to report the bill back to the House with amendments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member, presenting reports from committees, the honourable member from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 19th report of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs in relation to Bill C-61, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nation lands. The committee has studied the bill and has decided to report the bill back to the House with amendments.
Thank the honourable member. Presenting reports from committees, the honourable member from St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 104 and 114, I have the honour to present in both official languages the 72nd report of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs entitled Pilot Project to Include Inuit Languages on Federal Election Ballots in Nunavut.
I thank the honourable member. Introduction of private members' bills. Ms. Zerillo, seconded by Ms. Barron, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Canada Disability Benefit Act. This motion is deemed adopted. The honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Today, I am introducing a bill to protect the Canada Disability Benefit and the persons who will receive it from clawbacks. Thank you to the member of Nanaimo Lady Smith for seconding it and for the work that she does in her community for persons with disabilities. People with disabilities living in poverty experience the cruelty of clawbacks firsthand, because whenever they get the slightest increase in income, their critical government benefits are reduced. The skimming of benefits that they are entitled to pushes them farther behind. The era of perpetuating poverty through Liberal and Conservatives before them, cruel and callous clawbacks, has to end. And the negative impacts go farther than just bad economic policy. It's bad social policy too. People with disabilities are prevented from having a live-in relationship, marrying, leaving an abusive relationship, or even taking on roommates, because if they do, they risk losing their critical benefits. With my bill, which is already with my bill in relation to the Canada Disability Benefit, which is already woefully inadequate, the government can amend and modernize this new era of disability benefits that empowers people instead of punishing them. In closing, I raise my hands to the disability community and countless advocates who have continued to raise the issue. And again, I call on the government to do what is right. Adopt this bill, fix this historic wrong, and make sure that people with disabilities can live the life they choose.
Ms. Zerillo, seconded by Ms. Barron, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
When shall this bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House. First reading of Senate public bills. Motions. Mr. Zimmer, seconded by Mr. Melillo, moves that the 18th report of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs presented on Monday, November 25, 2024 be concurred in. Debate. The honourable member from Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's my honour to stand here today. I will be sharing my time with the member from Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock. So I got that right, yay. And the report states we want to the Standing Committee on Indigenous Northern Affairs wants to embark on a study to see the appearance of the Member of Parliament for Edmonton Centre, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, November 21st, 2024. Your committee has agreed to report the following: that the committee report to the House that the MP for Edmonton Centre appear before the committee for 2 hours independently by Friday, December 6, 2024, immediately following the completion and reporting back of C61 to the House, and that the report is tabled by the Chair in the House as soon as possible, no later than Monday, November 25th, 2024. And so, Mr. Speaker, the reason why we're going through this important report is the Minister from Edmonton Centre needs to come clean about his actions. And we all have heard about the other Randy story, as GHI, a company that he co-owned, was bidding on government contracts while claiming he wasn't, when it came out that he actually was. Number two, claiming to be of Indigenous heritage when he wasn't himself. And third, falsely bidding on Indigenous contracts. His company was his Indigenous company when he wasn't Indigenous and didn't have an Indigenous company. From a recent article in the news, Alberta MP from Edmonton Centre has resigned from cabinet amid allegations about his business dealings and criticism of his shifting claims about his Indigenous ancestry. The Prime Minister and the MP from Edmonton Centre have agreed that the MP from Edmonton Centre will step away from cabinet effective immediately. MP from Edmonton Centre will focus on clearing the allegations made against him, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister said in a statement. And this is why, Mr. Speaker, it's so important that the former minister appear at I-9 committee. Previous to that, he was scheduled to appear as minister, and what the NDP Liberal government has tried to do is say, well, since he's no longer a sitting minister, therefore he doesn't really need to come and appear at committee to answer for the allegations made against him. And that simply is unacceptable. It doesn't change that he was a long-serving member of this corrupt NDP Liberal government, and that he's got three very significant issues he needs to answer to the Canadian public for. Most of all, Indigenous communities. You know, one thing that colleagues of mine in this House have really highlighted: impersonating an Indigenous person or an Indigenous company is a severe offence. And it's fraudulent, and it's something that's just simply not acceptable for anybody in Canada, let alone a sitting minister of this NDP Liberal government. But, Mr. Speaker, we've also heard that the NDP Liberals are trying to do something to obfuscate and really have the minister, the former minister, appear, but do it with all the current and relevant ministers to INAN at the same time. So what that would do is it would kind of swamp the meeting with 4 or 3 ministers and this member from Edmonton Centre all at the same time, when we are asking and calling on the former minister to appear individually to answer questions for what he's done. Simply put, you know, the amount of time that he will have at committee will be well used to appear individually, at least for an hour, if not longer, to try and answer for some of the allegations that were made against him. And I think, it goes, a concern, I think, with Canadians across the country that, we spoke about the Green Slush Fund before and sort of this corruption within the front benches. And again, these aren't just sort of, the odd allegation here and there. It's really corruption at the highest level from sitting ministers of the government. And it was only recently, just a few weeks ago, that this minister was cut loose, as the news article stated. And he had held on for many, many months. The Prime Minister had kept him in his spot regardless of the allegations. And then more allegations started to pop up as a result, and it even got worse as the minister was allowed to remain in his minister's chair. And I think it was really after, I'll give credit to my colleagues for putting on the pressure to the sitting minister, the former minister, that he had to, they said the Prime Minister asked him to step down, but, I think, or resign, or however they want to phrase it. But it was really after pressure from the opposition, from the Conservatives on this side, that caused so much pressure with the Prime Minister and Canadians across the country. And I think it's even reflected in the polls. When you look at the polls across the country, the Liberals are really struggling, the NDP are really struggling because of these kind of allegations. And it's not like they deal with it quickly. They deal with it after months and months of pressure, months and months of people watching these videos on YouTube and social media. And they really are asking, why is that sitting minister still sitting minister when he's under this cloud of allegations and suspicion? Again, around some pretty significant issues. Impersonating an Indigenous person in Canada, as a sitting minister is really beyond the pale. So that's why it's necessary that the member from Edmonton Centre needs to come to committee. He needs to answer for what his response, or give his responses to what the questions will be from our members. And that needs to happen with a full meeting, not sort of as an attachment with a bunch of other ministers there getting asked questions at the same time. We're asking for him to appear as an individual. I think Canadians deserve, Indigenous people across the country deserve him answering for what he's done, and maybe clarify what he was trying to do with what ended up happening, what are the allegations. He's spoken many times in the House, and he's never been able to sort of get out of that shadow of these allegations. It's, like I said before, the cloud just has gotten darker, over him, whether the other Randy, as a GHI company co-owned, bidding on government contracts as a sitting minister. We just spoke about it at length, 20 minutes. The sitting minister for the environment was doing the exact same thing. It's like this, it's a sad state of affairs when this sort of acceptable corruption is in the front benches of the NDP Liberals today. But again, I think what we look forward to is that we get a chance to ask some tough questions of the former minister. And again, if nothing was done wrong, and it was this Prime Minister that said sunny ways. I think we all remember that in 2015. The best thing for integrity of the system is really to shine a light, to have no secrets, right? To really, and this was this Prime Minister's, this was his saying even. He talks about slogans of ours. Sunny ways was his slogan. And where has that gone today? All we have is government cover-up after cover-up after cover-up. Mr. Speaker, you are even challenging this government to produce unredacted documents to the Green Slush Fund. So it's not just that where we're trying to shine light on some of these accusations of this of a current minister and the current Prime Minister, but it needs to actually see the light of day. We need to see the minister in INAN committee. He needs to answer for the allegations against him. Again, those serious allegations. I think, again, Indigenous peoples across the country are expecting that, and Canadians at large are expecting that. Is that how could a sitting minister, so obviously do things that are fraudulent and keep being able to do it for as long as he was able to? It was only after, again, relentless pressure from again the Conservative Party on this side, and facts that just kept turning up, kept churning up as time went on, until finally, again, as the article said, that the Prime Minister and the MP from Edmonton Centre have agreed that the MP from Edmonton Centre will step away from Cabinet effective immediately. And this is a challenge for him to actually do this. In the article, it said, MP from Edmonton Centre will focus on clearing the allegations made against him, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister said in a statement. Here's a great opportunity to do exactly that as an individual, to clear the allegations against him. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate the opportunity today.
Before we, avant qu'on continue,
Before continuing, 2 questions and comments. I am now ready to rule on the point of order raised by the member for La Prairie on November 21st, 2024, regarding the designation of the final 4 supply days for the period ending on December 10th, 2024. In his point of order, the member for La Prairie asked whether the chair would intervene to designate the remaining opposition days in the hypothetical case that the 2 questions of privilege before the House remain under consideration through the end of the current supply period. The member said that the standing orders provide for 4 more opposition days this fall, and that in the past, the chair has designated days to meet the requirements of the standing orders. He also raised the possibility of temporarily setting aside the questions of privilege if it is necessary for the making of appropriations.
November 21st, 2024, on the same topic, I encouraged the House leaders to discuss a solution that would enable the House to reconcile these various responsibilities. The discussions do not seem to have been productive. Although the government has designated 3 opposition days, including today's, the chair notes that the House has been unable to take up the business of supply at the required time. The House remains in the situation described by the member for La Prairie. The House is solely responsible for granting supplies to the Crown, as provided by Standing Order 81. To that end, at the start of each session, it establishes a continuing order of the day for the consideration of supply. That order, as House of Commons Procedure and Practice 3rd edition explains on page 838, and I quote, remains on the agenda as an item of government orders and may be taken up at any time at the government's discretion, unquote. In other words, the designation of the days allotted to the business of supply is normally a prerogative of the government, and this business is considered during government orders. La Chambre assume ses responsabilités à l'égard des subsides.
The House executes its supply responsibilities through a very specific mechanism, which is described in Standing Order 81, adopting 1 or more appropriation bills granting sums to defray charges and expenses of the federal public administration, is the final step of that process. For the current supply period, such a bill must be adopted by December 10th. Under Standing Order 81-17, the chair is required, no later than the last day of this period, to interrupt proceedings and put every question necessary to dispose of these appropriations. That said, one principle of our parliamentary government is that members have the right to air grievances before considering the government's financial requirements. There exists a vital balance between grievances and supply, the former being considered on supply days. What is to be done if the government is unable to designate those days? The member for La Prairie raised the chair's role in this situation by citing an important precedent. On Thursday, March 22nd, 1990, a dispute between the government and the opposition prevented the last 2 opposition days that could be allotted for the supply period ending on March 26th from being designated. Consequently, on that day, Speaker Fraser designated Friday, March 23rd and Monday, March 26th, 1990 as opposition days. In a ruling rendered on March 26th, 1990, on page 9759 of the debates, he explained, and I quote, "The standing orders list the number of allotted days that there will be in each supply period, and where the government has failed to designate sufficient days to meet the requirements of the standing orders, By attrition, those days left in the period must become allotted days when no other alternative is possible in order to comply with the standing orders. Hence, Friday and today had to become opposition days, whether specifically designated by this government or not." Unquote. However, the House was not considering questions of privilege when Speaker Fraser had to rule on the issue.
November 21, 2024, the Chair outlined the House's responsibility to grant supplies in accordance with the specific mechanisms provided by the standing orders. The Chair also remarked that a privilege motion must take priority over all other orders of the day. Still, this practice is not absolute. As we have seen on a few occasions this fall, the House may, through a special order or under a unique specific standing order, require a particular action to be taken at a particular time. For example, pursuant to Standing Order 66, the House resumed consideration of motions to concur in committee reports after debate on them had been adjourned, even though these motions were orders of the day. In the same vein, the continuing order of the day for supply enables, and in fact the standing orders require, the House to dispose of supply matters by December 10, 2024. Despite the questions of privilege before the House, the Chair must conclude that the provisions of the standing orders governing the consideration of supply remain in effect. The Chair further concludes that the balance between the allotted days and the adoption of appropriations must be maintained, and that, as a result, the remaining supply days must take place. Puisqu'il reste 4 jours des subsides à désigner.
Since 4 supply days are yet to be designated, and 48 hours notice is required for opposition motions, unless the House decides otherwise, the Chair declares that the last 4 sitting days in the current period, namely Thursday, December 5th, Friday, December 6th, Monday, December 9th, and Tuesday, December 10th, 2024, will be allotted days.
Thursday, December 5, Friday, December 6, and Tuesday, December 10, consideration of the questions of privilege under the orders of the day will resume once the House has finished the debates on the business of supply, if possible. As for the sitting of Monday, December 9, the questions of privilege will be taken up at the start of the sitting and considered until the orders of the day are called at noon. I thank all members for their attention. Going back to questions et commentaires, l'honorable
Questions and comments?
Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this debate has been going on for quite some time, and I think we've asked every possible question that can be asked. So my question of the member who gave a speech is in relation to the news that we heard today regarding foreign interference and the Conservative leadership campaign. In particular, we heard something that was quite interesting, and that was in regards to the member from Calgary Nose Hill, and whether or not she was approached by individuals in that regard to influence her position, in particular foreign individuals not of Canadian origin or not Canadian citizens. And so my question for the member is he aware that just recently in the Industry Committee, the member from Calgary Nose Hill was in committee, and once she was approached by CBC, immediately left the room, leaving all of her stuff on the table, and is now back in her office participating in the meeting remotely. Does he not think that it would be best for her to confront the situation and to answer honestly about whether or not she was approached by individuals in regards to interfering in the leadership race that took place that elected the leader of the opposition today?
Well, member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Well, Madam Speaker, and I think Canadians out there, the thing that we're talking about today is to have the former former NDP Liberal minister who had to resign in shame, is to have him appear at the I-9 committee to answer for the issues that he has really been a part of and answer, to really clear his name. As the article says, the MP from Edmonton Centre will focus on clearing the allegations made against him, a spokesperson for the Prime Minister said in a statement. Once again, the Liberals trying to change the channel on their scandal-ridden government once again.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton. Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Madam Speaker, the disgraced member for Edmonton Centre's company applied fraudulently for 2 government contracts representing themselves as a wholly owned Indigenous company when that wasn't true, in a disgraceful effort to steal contracts from legitimate Indigenous businesses. The Prime Minister was aware that the minister did that, and yet for days the Prime Minister defended the minister. It was only when the Edmonton police announced that they were launching a criminal investigation that he was finally bounced from cabinet. So what does that say about the low ethical standards set by the Prime Minister, and could the Prime Minister's reluctance to fire the member for Edmonton Centre from cabinet have anything to do with the fact that, like the member for Edmonton Centre, the Prime Minister is a cultural appropriator? Great question.
The Honourable Member for Peace River North, Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Right, thank you. And that's actually a good question to the relevant subject at hand, isn't it, House? And for the Canadians watching out there, that's what a question, proper question to somebody across the way looks like. Instead of trying to obfuscate and cover up their scandals, there's a great question. And the member, it is a great question. In this scandal-ridden government, the member is very aware of the Green Slush Fund and the many efforts that have been made to cover up their scandals, their corruption, et cetera, et cetera. But I know it's alarming, I think, for most Canadians and for us too, how long it took for him. He still was sitting on the front benches for weeks under these dark clouds of these allegations, and it just kept getting worse. We did see a shift, though, in the last week, is when normally NDP Liberals, when they don't want to have their minister answer for something that's corrupt, they have somebody else answer the question for them. We saw he had to sit out and answer the questions himself, which showed there was some erosion in the relationship with the Prime Minister and that particular minister.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech, an important speech about an important issue that is shameful to this Parliament. I also would like to thank him for his work on committee. Now, how do First Nations people feel right now, knowing that a government minister is taking on First Nations identity to have access to government contracts? So there are contracts which are set aside, 5% of the budget set aside. And this is also a matter of being resilient. And then these contracts end up being given to people who are not Indigenous. How does the member feel about that?
Yeah, thank you to the member from the Bloc, who is also a sitting member of the INED committee. It sits down the way from us. I can tell you how First Nations feel in my community. They feel absolutely disgusted by former actions by this current Prime Minister, and then these latest actions to really shield a minister that's been fraudulent in his claims about being Indigenous. It's shameful. And guess what? Next election, they're voting Conservative.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brook.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Today I rise in the House of Commons to address a matter that has serious implications for public trust, accountability, and the integrity of our democratic institutions. It is a matter that speaks to the very principles that Canadians hold dear, the principles of transparency, honesty, and the fair application of our laws. This is an issue, Speaker, that is both deeply troubling and critically important to the future of our nation. It is an issue that strikes at the heart of fairness and those we expect and the actions we expect from those in power. We live in a country that prides itself on its commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We recognize that this is a journey, a process of healing, understanding, and building trust between Indigenous communities and the Canadian governments. But this process is only as meaningful when it's rooted in honesty and respect. The issue at hand is the controversial conduct surrounding the former Minister of Employment, the member for Edmonton Centres, his past business dealings, specifically his connection to Global Health Imports, a company he co-owned. This matter not only raises questions about potential conflicts of interest, but also brings to the forefront serious concerns regarding the manipulation of Indigenous business procurement programs for personal and political gain. This issue that calls into question both the ethical standards expected of our public officials and the integrity of programs designed to benefit Indigenous entrepreneurs and communities. We're faced with a troubling situation in which an individual, a public servant no less, is accused of exploiting the very tools that were meant to uplift and empower Indigenous communities for personal advantage. The procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses was established by this government to ensure that Indigenous communities can participate meaningfully in federal contracting opportunities, and yet we are now confronted with the possibility that this program is being misused by individuals with questionable motives. The member for Edmonton Centre has long portrayed himself as an ally of Indigenous communities and at times a person of Indigenous descent. However, his claims about his heritage have shifted dramatically over that time, raising serious questions about the sincerity and accuracy of his statements. In 2017, Speaker, the member referred to himself as non-status adopted Cree, tracing his ancestry to his great-grandmother, who he claimed was Cree. This claim was repeated in Parliament, where he spoke proudly of his heritage as part of his personal narrative. But just a few years later, the member changed his story. In an interview in 2021, he stated that he was a white, cisgender member of the community. He publicly distanced himself from any Indigenous identity, acknowledging that instead his heritage was tied to a status Métis family member through adoption. The stark shift was quite sudden, and the timing of these changes raises questions about his true understanding of his heritage. The member for Edmonton Centre, along with his former business partner, Stephen Anderson, co-founded Global Health Imports at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The company initially focused on distributing personal protective equipment such as masks, gloves, and face shields. It was, at the time, a business venture that appeared to be in line with the urgent needs of the day, as a global health crisis required swift and wide-ranging action. However, the issue arose when GHI began to identify itself as a wholly owned Indigenous business in federal procurement bids. Claims that were made to gain access to preferential treatment under Canada's Indigenous procurement programs. These claims were made even though neither the member nor Anderson appeared to have verifiable Indigenous heritage that met the strict criteria for participation in the PSIB. While the government's procurement strategy allows for preferential treatment to companies that are genuinely Indigenous owned, it requires that such companies meet clear criteria, such as being at least 51% owned by Indigenous individuals. As it turned out, neither the member for Edmonton Centre nor Stephen Anderson could demonstrate they actually met that requirement. Global Health Imports, as we all know, was never registered on the official list of eligible Indigenous businesses. Furthermore, neither the member nor Anderson ever substantiated their Indigenous heritage when questioned. The core of the issue is the deliberate misrepresentation of GHI's ownership, which, by falsely claiming to be Indigenous owned, sought to leverage government programs meant for Indigenous peoples, diverting opportunities and funds from businesses that genuinely meet the criteria. This raises significant questions about the truthfulness of the claims made by the member for Edmonton Centre and the appearance of a deliberate attempt to misappropriate federal resources, especially given that those claims were central to securing lucrative government contracts. The government has been unequivocal about the need for companies to prove their status before accessing these very programs, yet there appears to be no official follow-up or verification by the Minister for Indigenous Services or her department in this case. The reality is, GHI did not meet the criteria to qualify for Indigenous procurement programs. This is not just a matter of a failed business bid, this is a matter of ethical conduct. This is about whether the rules governing Indigenous procurement are being followed and whether those who falsely claim Indigenous identity are allowed to exploit the very programs meant to support actual Indigenous businesses. Indigenous leaders such as Shannon Mensdawabin, the CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, have voiced their concerns about this kind of behavior. He stated that these incidents are symptomatic of broader problems within the PSIB, noting that fraudulent claims of misrepresentation are undermining the program and ultimately harming the various communities it is meant to actually support. This lack of transparency and accountability is quite troubling, Speaker. Arthur Schaefer, the director of the Centre for Professional and Applied Ethics at the University of Manitoba, has argued that programs like the PSIB, in order for them to remain actually effective, the government must hold individuals accountable when they misrepresent themselves as Indigenous or try to exploit these programs for personal gain. As we move forward, Speaker, there are several lessons we must learn from this controversy. First, we must demand greater transparency from public officials, in particular, when they are involved in decisions that affect vulnerable communities. Second, we must strengthen the safeguards in place to prevent the exploitation of procurement programs meant for Indigenous businesses. The public must have confidence that all elected officials are held to the highest standard of ethical conduct, and that means an independent, thorough investigation into the member for Edmonton Centre's actions and his potential breaches of the Conflict of Interest Act. We must have transparency into whether his financial interests in GHI influenced the awarding of government contracts and whether any rules were broken in that process. It means we must also re-examine even, the strength of our ethics laws and those covering Indigenous peoples, including the Indigenous procurement programs, and ensure that these programs are not abused by officials looking to profit at the expense of Indigenous communities. And if they are, we need to know what measures we can take to strengthen our systems, close those loopholes, and ensure that these programs are used for that intended purpose to empower and uplift Indigenous peoples, not enrich the privileged few. And we cannot ignore these concerns, Speaker. The very integrity of our democratic institutions depends on the peoples who hold positions of power living up to the highest ethical standards. It's time for the members from Edmonton Centre to answer for its actions and for this government to take the necessary steps to ensure that this type of behavior is not tolerated in the future. And of course, as we look into the broader implications of the case, we must ask ourselves how many other cases like this are out there. How many more individuals are attempting to pass themselves off as Indigenous to access resources and advantages that should be reserved for the very communities we are striving to support? And as I wrap up, Speaker, I would like to move, seconded by the member for St. Albert Edmonton, that the motion be amended by deleting all words after the word "that" and substituting the following. The 18th report of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, presented to the House on Monday, November 25th, 2024, be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the committee for further consideration with instruction that it report back to the House no later than Monday, January 27th, 2025, on whether the member for Edmonton Centre, who was the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages when the House adopted the order on Tuesday, November 19th, 2024, requiring his attendance before that committee, has appeared in conformity with that order. Thank you, Speaker.
Mr. Schmiley, seconded by Mr. Cooper, moves the following amendment. that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word that and substituting the following. The 18th report of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, presented to the House on Monday, November 25th, 2024, be not now concurred in, but that it be recommitted to the committee for further consideration, with instruction that it report back to the House no later than Monday, January 27, 2025, on whether the member for Edmonton Centre, who was the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages, when the House adopted an order on Tuesday, November 19, 2024, requiring his attendance before that committee, has appeared in conformity with that order. The amendment is in order. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. No one's surprised. The Conservatives continue this multi-million-dollar self-serving game, and they've pulled out yet another concurrence report, and then they're going to send the concurrence report, or the report itself, back to committee. Nothing new there. That's, in fact, been their tactic that they've been using now for weeks, and I'll get the opportunity to expand on that. But the question that I have for the member is that why is it the Conservative Party is so focused on the issue of character assassination more so than the needs of Canadians, and we've seen that illustrated all of the time. A good example of that would be when that very member decided to vote against giving a GST holiday for taxpayers in Canada, even though, as a political entity, they like to give the false impression that they want to cut taxes.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Coeur d'Alene, Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I think I wrote that down. It's a multi-million-dollar self-serving venture. Well, I would argue that's exactly what the member for Edmonton Centre tried to do. The member from Edmonton Centre and his company he co-owned checked a box claiming to be Indigenous-owned, claiming to be wholly Indigenous-owned, thereby bidding on a contract reserved for Indigenous-owned businesses. So the hypocrisy is unbelievable here. So you have a minister that had no problem trying to push down legitimate Indigenous-owned businesses to try to secure and enrich himself. Unbelievable.
Questions et commentaires,
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague and the Vice Chair of INAN for his intervention. The motion that he has just tabled, the amendment, is it related to the fact that they just wanted to fool around our committee because they were saying that interpretation, well, we wanted to have the Minister of Official Languages there who would answer, and then it was the member for Edmonton Centre. But now the Liberals wanted to send us the minister, the member for Dieppe. Is today's motion, is it directly linked to this Liberal trick? I'd like to ask a second question. In his speech, he talked about penalties that the member for Edmonton Centre should receive. What consequences should he face aside from the shame that he has brought to his political party?
Haliburton, Kawarta Lakes, Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Thank you to my friend from the block across the way and to his work on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee as well. In short, yes, it is. As he correctly pointed out in his question, that the Liberals tried to play games on the committee, tried to ensure it was the new interim Minister for Employment covering the member of Edmonton Centre that was going to actually appear before committee. Clearly, that was not the intent of the motion. The intent of the motion is to get the member from Edmonton Centre and order him, if you will, to appear before committee. In terms of what punishments he should to face, I guess that's up to different agencies. I would hope that there's enough shame brought to him and the Liberal Party that Indigenous people have a second thought about voting for Liberals, but also the fact that hopefully he decides it's not ready for him to run in the next election.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member. I'm happy that I have a chance to stand up today because I do have some questions that I'm hoping the member can shed some light on, perhaps. Madam Speaker, we know the Conservatives have been calling for an election for I think about 6 months now. We know this. And on Friday, there was a non-confidence vote that was put forward by the Conservatives. It was attacking the leader of the NDP. And when the Conservatives were asked to suspend the question of privilege by the government House Leader to get unanimous consent to be able to debate this exact non-confidence motion that they put forward, they said no. And so perhaps the, Madam Speaker, if the member could clarify, I think Canadians are curious, what's going on? Where's the logic behind saying no to the exact motion that they put forward to actually see an outcome that they're pushing for?
Exactly.
Honourable member for Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes Brock.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the question across the way. This is coming from the party who not once but twice, multiple times, voted confidence in the government, prolonging the Liberal power grab here that we continue to see. And don't worry, there will be an extra motion very soon. Don't worry from the member opposite. Although right now our focus is trying to get to the bottom of the member from Edmonton Centre, what he may or may not have done in terms of his company applying for contracts, government contracts, and claiming to be wholly Indigenous owned.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to be able to rise and try to explain in the best way I can in terms of why it is that we're actually having the debate that we're having this afternoon, Madam Speaker. And it's actually quite unfortunate. The issue of character assassination is something in which the Conservatives have been focused on even back 10 years ago when the leader of the Liberal Party was first elected leader. And absolutely nothing has changed over the last 10-plus years, Madam Speaker, where they try to identify an individual and then attack the very character of the person. In the many years I've had the opportunity to know the member from Edmonton Centre, never, ever have I ever had him come up to me in any fashion whatsoever to try to give any sort of an impression that he was Indigenous himself, Madam Speaker. I really look at a lot of the things in which the Conservatives do as a way to try to discredit individuals inside this chamber. And quite frankly, it's at a very great cost. I will often say, and I have, and the Hansard will clearly demonstrate that over the years, as the Conservative Party is so much focused on destroying the characters or the elected officials in the House of Commons, that we've had a Prime Minister and a government continue to be focused on Canadians, Madam Speaker. As much as they try to sidestep the important issues and bring in the character assassinations, as a government, we have been focused on Canadians to ensure that Canadians are a part of the solution in building a stronger, healthier economy. Focusing in on Canada's middle class and those aspiring to be a part of it. Focusing on ensuring that we have an economy that works for all Canadians, Madam Speaker. That has been this government's focus for years. And the type of response that we get from the Conservative Party is consistently attacking individuals. You might get the odd one that steps up to the plate and says some things that are a little bit more constructive, Madam Speaker. But that is discouraged in the Conservative caucus.
That's right.
Because we know, Madam Speaker, because we have Conservatives and MPs on that other side that have made it very clear they don't have a choice. They have members in the leader's office, the Conservative leader's office, that actually follows them, that stalks them, Madam Speaker, to see what it is they're actually saying. That actually made national news last week, Madam Speaker, to the degree in which Conservative MPs are being stalked by within their own caucus, and they get some stars if they do some things right, and they get some of those stars taken away if they do something wrong. For example, if they talk to Liberal members of Parliament, that's a bad thing according to the Conservative caucus and their new rules, Madam Speaker. You want to get a star? Well, maybe attack the character of someone like what we're witnessing today. By far, the best way to get those simple stars is to repeat the slogans. Look at today in itself, Madam Speaker, and you can see how many times members stood up and they gave their slogans. It's because it's encouraged, and they're told that they will get stars if they do that, Madam Speaker. We have Conservative members that are talking about how freedom within the caucus has become scarcer as a direct result of a leader, Madam Speaker. So if they want to talk about character assassination, I'd like to share some thoughts about that in regards to the leader of the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker, that Canadians should be aware of, Madam Speaker. You know, this game, this multi-million-dollar self-serving game that the Conservatives is playing today and have been playing for the last 6 weeks here on the floor of the House of Commons, Madam Speaker. Not only is it a substantive financial cost, but it has also had a very negative impact on a legislative agenda, Madam Speaker. An agenda that would have saw legislation passed to protect children from online predators, to protect sexually abused women and others, Madam Speaker, within the Canadian Forces by taking out of the military court, putting into civilian courts. Legislation dealing with Canada's supply lines, Madam Speaker. We can talk about the full economic statement, not to mention private members' bills, opposition day motions, all forms of legislation that could have been being debated. But no. Why? Because the Conservative leadership has made the decision to filibuster on the floor of the House of Commons. So when we talk about character assassination, what we're witnessing in regards to the attack from opposition Conservatives towards the former minister, the member from Edmonton, Madam Speaker, I would suggest that the one that's orchestrating it is the leader of the Conservative Party, and he needs to look in the mirror, Madam Speaker. After all, he's the one that's in borderline contempt of Parliament by the million-dollar-plus game that he is orchestrating on the floor of the House of Commons. And that's what's happening today. We are seeing a political game because they believe, the Conservative Party believes, that they know better. They know that unredacted documents should be given to the RCMP without any hesitation. Just give it to the RCMP. And that's what the leader of the Conservative Party believes, Madam Speaker. Even though the RCMP say no, even though the Auditor General of Canada says no. So on the one hand, they're going to take into consideration as a part of their filibuster a serious issue of Indigenous businesses and opportunities and use that as a way to attack the character of a member of Parliament. Yet I would suggest to you that we need to start reflecting more on the attitudes and the types of things in which the leader of the Conservative Party is doing, because it is purely self-serving. It's not in Canada's best interest. You have a leader that is solely focused on preventing healthy debate inside the chamber, Madam Speaker. You know, my colleague posed a question earlier in regards to the foreign interference issue. And again, it's rooted right back to the leader of the Conservative Party. So when they criticize the member from Edmonton Centre Listen to the complaints and the issues regarding the leader of the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker.
Of order from the Honourable Member for Calgary Heritage.
Question of relevance. We're here to talk about the appearance of the member from
The Honourable Member knows that those are issues of great latitude, and I expect that within the next 11 minutes the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary would come to relevance.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. If the member was around a bit more, and maybe listened to a lot of the discussions that have been taking place over the last number of weeks, he will find that it is absolutely relevant when you're starting to utilize motions of this nature in order to attack actions of members of Parliament. And to try to say that this is not relevant because, after all, I'm reflecting on the motivations and the character of his own leader, oh wow. Let's be really super sensitive if it's a Conservative that we're talking about. But no, Liberal members of Parliament are free game. That's the attitude, Madam Speaker. How they try to prevent members from being able to express the reality in terms of what's actually taking place inside the chamber today, Madam Speaker. And I say shame on the member for interrupting on what is, in fact, an important statement that needs to be made. Because at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, yes, the issue of Indigenous businesses is of the utmost importance. In fact, Madam Speaker, over the weekend, we had a wonderful historical moment in the province of Manitoba. On Portage in Main, the 20th floor of a building that's now owned by the Red River Métis. David Chartrand and the Métis Association, or Métis Nation, I should say, Madam Speaker, signed off on a treaty. So now we have the Manitoba Métis Nation, national government on treaty. And I can tell you that whether it's that important document that we signed off on just this past weekend, or literally the tens of millions of dollars that we have provided in terms of encouraging and supporting Indigenous businesses, we have been there, Madam Speaker. But you don't see that necessarily being talked about because it doesn't fit their narrative, Madam Speaker. And that's why it's important that people that follow the debates that take place in the House of Commons not be fooled by what it is that the Conservative Party does and has been doing for the last 6 weeks. Don't think this is about concern over Indigenous businesses. Nothing could be further from the truth, Madam Speaker. It's a part of the game that they're playing. And that game, Madam Speaker, happens to be of a filibuster to prevent the government from doing the businesses that will, in fact, support Indigenous and all Canadians in many, many different ways. And then they use that in order to criticize and single out a particular member, as I will now continue pointing out the hypocrisy that's coming out of the Conservative leadership, Madam Speaker, or the office of the leader of the Conservative Party. As I was pointing out, the member from Kingston and the Isles, the Deputy House Leader for the government, made it very clear about how another member of the House, which is being reported on in national news today, was actually interfered with through foreign interference. Why is that important to note, Madam Speaker? Because, again, we're talking about the leader of the Conservative Party and his unwillingness to be able to get security clearance. Think about that. The only leader in the House of Commons. In fact, Madam Speaker, if you want to be an intern for the Conservative Party, you're required to get a security clearance. But not if you're the leader of the Conservative Party. And then today, through the news, we find out that there is a direct link that the leader of the Conservative Party, during his own leadership, was in fact interfered with through foreign interference. Remember a year ago how often we were hearing that issue of foreign interference? The Conservatives were jumping all over each other raising the issue, until we caught wind that there were maybe some Conservatives at play, and it might not necessarily reflect well on them, Madam Speaker. Oh, then how attitudes quickly change. When's the last time we've seen them stand up in question period and pose a question on foreign interference, Madam Speaker? I suspect it has a lot to do with the fact that the Conservative leader doesn't want to talk about the issue anymore because of something that's there that's preventing him from wanting to get the security clearance. People today, the news story today is all about leadership interference. That might be one aspect to it. I think there's more to it, Madam Speaker. I think there's more to why it is that the leader of the official opposition does not want to get the security clearance. And I believe Canadians have a right to know. So if members across the way want to use this particular report to have their reflections on the member from Edmonton Centre, I think that while they stand up and they talk about that what they should be also doing is reflecting and maybe looking in the mirror and thinking about the leader of the Conservative Party. Should they not be applying the same sort of pressure, the same sort of tactics, maybe even within their own caucus at the very least, and call into question why it is that their own leader refuses to get that security clearance, Madam Speaker? Yes, I believe foreign interference is one of those reasons that had a direct impact on his own leadership. One of the reasons why he might even be the leader of the Conservative Party today. I understand that Patrick Brown, well, Conservatives laugh. Well, I don't think Patrick Brown was laughing. We actually have to summon him to committee in order to find the truth. I wonder maybe if we should be summoning him to the bar. That's something the Conservatives like to do. We'll have to wait and find out just in terms of how open and honest they are in terms of the answers coming from members on that particular committee, Madam Speaker. I look forward to hearing some of the results. Maybe, on the motion that we have, there's an amendment. And the amendment is to actually call and demand that the member from Edmonton Centre go before the committee. And as Conservatives tell me all the time, Madam Speaker, we have unfettered rights here on the floor of the House of Commons. So even if it's a majority government, it don't matter because we have unfettered rights and it has to be respected no matter what, according to Conservatives, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm wondering if the member from Calgary Nose Hill should actually be summoned to the very same committee that Patrick is going to, Madam Speaker, Patrick Brown. It would be interesting to hear her thoughts on foreign investment. One day she's supporting Patrick Brown, or foreign interference, I should say. One day she's supporting Patrick Brown, and then there's a conversation that takes place. Many would suggest to you that it qualifies as foreign interference. And then the next day, she's no longer supporting Patrick Brown. There's something there, Madam Speaker, and then a week passes by and she doesn't go back to supporting. And when I say supporting, I believe she was actually the co-campaign manager or something of that fact. I think we need to get to the bottom of that. So much like the motion that's being suggested here, I would suggest to all the committee members, as opposed to being instructed by the House of Commons, maybe they should be proactive and ask for the member from Calgary Nose Hill to appear before the committee, Madam Speaker. I think that would be very helpful. And I would encourage the member from Calgary Nose Hill, in fact, to volunteer. When I read the story, she seems to be offside with what others are saying. Well, gee whiz, where have we heard that before? Isn't that the same thing that's happening with the member from Edmonton Centre and other allegations that are being made, where the member from Edmonton Centre doesn't agree with those allegations?
Oh, that's different, though. That's when it's a Conservative.
As my colleague points out, oh yeah, but don't mix Conservatives and Liberals.
Different standards.
I tell you, totally different standards. At the end of the day, I think that maybe we should be getting the committee and asking the committee to have the member from Calgary Nose Hill come before the same committee, maybe be following Patrick Brown, Madam Speaker, so we can hear from Patrick Brown how foreign interference was directly involved in the leadership of the Conservative Party. The very same leadership convention in which the current leader was elected at, and the current leader refuses to get that security clearance, Madam Speaker. Why? Because he wants to be naive, I guess, Madam Speaker, on the issue. But it would be really good to see the two of them sitting there and being held accountable on foreign interference. I suspect you're not going to get a motion from that effect coming from the Conservative Party, Madam Speaker, because after all, transparency only matters when it's Conservatives attacking, using character assassinations against Liberals. That's all that matters from the Conservative point of view. There is a responsibility of accountability for the Conservatives too, Madam Speaker, and I will continue to push for that accountability. And on the final note, to encourage the leader of the Conservative Party to do the right thing and get a security clearance.
The honourable member for Southwick Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The member from Winnipeg North, gets in here, all sanctimonious, with all sorts of machinations of what's happening over on the Conservative side, and making it up as he goes along. Madam Speaker, he says that we are bringing forward a filibuster. We're on a different motion than what he was debating this whole time. We're talking about a concurrence report from the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. And instead, he goes off on tirades, accusing the member from Calgary or Nose Hill as being interfered with, when her own statements to the CBC and the statement that she released on social media said that she was not. And so for him to stand in this place and to disparage the comments made by the member of Winnipeg, or from Calgary Nose Hill, is a disservice to all honourable members in this House. Now, Madam Speaker, he wants to talk about filibustering, and yet nobody has spoken more in this House since forever in the history of Canada, but definitely at this point in time when we are talking about the issues of both this concurrence motion and the question of privilege as it relates to the Green Slush Fund. So, Madam Speaker, let me just ask the member this. Is he going to continue to slow down the business of this House, or is he going to continue to...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Truly amazing, Madam Speaker. Truly amazing. If the Conservatives are complaining because I'm trying to hold them to account for the types of things in which they do inside on the floor of the House of Commons. He talks about, our poor member, the member from Calgary Nose Hill. Hey, she says that she's innocent. Well, Madam Speaker, think about it. Before you pose the question, give it some thought. What are they doing with the member from Edmonton Centre?
Oh my God.
Where's this double standard come from? Seriously. At the end of the day, they need to understand that it's not only government, there is also opposition responsibilities. And I don't see a response.
And other opposition members would like questions. The Honourable Député d'Abitibi.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg North for his speech. But I was a bit disappointed because this is one member who I particularly enjoy listening to here. And he manages to constantly renew himself on issues that aren't always easy to get a grip on. But today I find him off topic, and it's a bit disappointing. The main topic, in my view, and that's why the Bloc supports it, is the usurpation or the theft of Indigenous identity. People use these false claims to get access to benefits that are for Indigenous people when Indigenous people don't even recognize those false claimants' identity. So the solution is simple. There should be a registry made by and for members of First Nations so they get to decide who is and isn't a part of their nation. Would the member for Winnipeg North support that approach?
Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the comments, and my apologies in the sense that if I only had more time, I would have gotten to a number of things that I actually had listed. And for example, Madam Speaker, as of November 18th, 2024, there has actually been 2,945 businesses listed on the IBD. Of the 2,945, 111 of them are Indigenous businesses that are actually joint ventures, which is greater than the 3%. In 2022, during the first fiscal year, of 5% target, ISC did a comprehensive review of businesses listed on the IBD, including verifying eligibility and 51% ownership. 1,100 listings were removed as a result of this review. For me personally, what it amplifies is the fact that we need to do more diligence on the issue. And there's no doubt about that. I was interested in the member's comment in terms of a registry. I would like to think that there is an obligation for all of us to look at ways in which we can ensure that there's more credibility and strength within to ensure that the way in which we have procurements are in fact being done in a proper fashion in which all of us would agree to. But I think
the honourable member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'm happy because we rarely get to hear from him. The NDP suggested that there be a break on the GST. The Liberals went with only 2 months, unfortunately. We would have liked it to be longer. But then there's also the $250 check for workers, which is interesting, but seniors and retired people would be excluded because they don't have any employment income. So I hope the member will work with us so that we can help seniors who are truly in need. I'd just like to remind the honourable member that this doesn't really relate to the topic before us. The honourable parliamentary secretary.
I actually appreciate the question. Working with the NDP has ultimately allowed the government in many ways to come across common policy initiatives that are helping Canadians, and we're actually able to get things done. And the GST holiday on a number of different products for the holiday season is an excellent example of how it is that we're able to get something that's tangible, delivered. It's going to allow Canadians to be given a bit of a break during the holiday season, Madam Speaker. I see that as a very strong, powerful thing.
Honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The member from Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman said moments ago, he said, well, the member from Calgary, Nose Hill, she said that it didn't happen. Actually, you got to read what she actually said in that story, Madam Speaker. What she said is she said, I was not coerced. I left the campaign of Patrick Brown on my own volition. But that's not what we're talking about, Madam Speaker. We're not talking about why she chose to leave. What we're talking about is whether or not there was foreign interference. So the question is not why did she resign from the campaign? The question is, did anybody approach her? Did a foreign diplomat specifically approach her? What does the parliamentary secretary have to contribute to that in terms of what he thinks that means?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Madam Speaker, and that is the reason why that the member from Calgary Nose Hill should go before the committee, because the member is right on. It's if you have been approached by a foreign diplomat that comes to you in any fashion, or an agent of another government comes to you and makes a suggestion, and those suggestions that were actually made to her, she seemed to have conveyed it to other people that have actually, more than one person, that is prepared to potentially come forward. That is foreign interference. She should go before the committee.
Honourable member for Mission Matsqui-Fraser-Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. In respect to the concurrence report that we're debating today, will the member from Winnipeg please apologize to all Canadians of Indigenous ancestry for the horrible actions of the former cabinet minister, the member from Edmonton Centre? Secondly, will he apologize to all the women he has silenced in this House of Commons, taking up all of the time of government orders year after year? Women are not allowed to speak in the Liberal Party thanks to him. Will he apologize for his egregious actions?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I will not apologize for a government that has been more feminist than any other government in the history of Canada, where we have seen 50% plus at times more women around the cabinet table. I have no problem in terms of recognizing to the degree in which this government looks at things through a gender lens in dealing with issues such as the budget, Madam Speaker. I have no problem in terms of comparing and contrasting the Conservatives' attitudes towards women versus the attitudes that this government has actually taken. Quite the contrast, and I know that there are many women within the caucus that are more than happy to take on the Conservatives on this particular issue, Madam Speaker.
Very brief question. The honourable member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Madam Speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague, it's interesting that he says that names were taken off the list of Indigenous businesses, but why did it take scandals like ArriveCan to get this government doing something? So my question is, if Indigenous people themselves could define who was recognized as an Indigenous business, wouldn't that have helped the government avoid more scandals?
Secretary, very brief answer.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The member makes reference to issues that come before the government, and at times the government ministers do need to take specific actions. There is a learning curve depending on different types of situations, and where that has been afforded, ministers have in fact taken action.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable.
Resuming debate. Just a minute before we resume debate. It's my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows.
Asquith, Fraser Canyon, Housing. The Honourable Member for Spadina, Fort York, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Abitibi-Temiskaming. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And this will be an opportunity for me to speak about identity, and particularly about cultural appropriation. Identity as a collective engagement for First Nations people in a context of reconciliation. So I rise today to speak to the 18th report, which was tabled by the Indigenous Northern Affairs Committee, which deals with the issue of identity theft among First Nations, Métis of the Red River Settlement, and the Inuit. The committee has tabled this report, and it's good that we're talking about it because it should have been a priority for quite some time now. It's a pleasure for me to talk about it today and to raise the essential questions that need to be asked. Identity is not an abstract concept. It's an anchor. It's something that binds us to our past, it guides us in our presence, and it illuminates our future. But it's not something that should be claimed lightly. It's a promise that we make to our community, to our people, and to those who will come after us. It's certainly not a privilege, as the federal government would have us believe. It is a fundamental right, the fundamental right of a nation. But what happens when that promise is betrayed? What happens when identity is exploited, stolen, or instrumentalized for personal or political gain? What happens when those who should be the guardians of that identity, governments and institutions, fail to protect something that is sacred to so many communities? Today, I think we need to reflect on what it means to protect identity. Not just our own, but also those of others. And above all, we need to think about the real consequences, the economic, cultural, and political consequences of identity appropriation. This is something that needs to be a priority, Madam Speaker. The Indigenous Northern Affairs Committee has undertaken work that is essential, it's urgent, it's unavoidable. It's not just a political responsibility, it's a moral imperative. We are called upon to answer a crucial question that has been set aside for far too long. How can we guarantee the integrity of identity recognition processes while at the same time respecting the legitimate rights of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples? Several ministers have already been questioned on this subject, as have civil servants whose decisions must now be re-examined in the light of recent events. Experts have also contributed to enlightening the committee on the loopholes that have allowed abuses to occur and who have also proposed solutions. We need to stop dancing around this issue. The misappropriation of Indigenous identity is not just an administrative detail. It's not an isolated case. This is an injustice that undermines our efforts at reconciliation and which erodes the trust that communities have in our institutions. By dithering, by standing idly by, we've allowed unacceptable situations to multiply. It's time we fix this issue, and we have to do it with determination, with courage. We can't ignore recent events that have shaken public trust in our institutions. The affair surrounding the former minister, the member for Edmonton Centre, is a perfect illustration of the dangers of identity theft and its consequences for relations between government and Indigenous peoples. To falsely claim Indigenous identity to gain access to benefits or privileges, as has been alleged, is not only a serious ethical breach, but it's also a betrayal of the true members of these communities. This scandal highlights the urgency of reviewing our identity recognition processes so that we can ensure total transparency in government practices and restore trust in our institutions. We have a responsibility to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to correct these injustices. We need to listen to their concerns. We need to act to protect their rights and their integrity. The mistakes of the past must not be repeated, and the government must show leadership by putting in place clear and fair mechanisms to prevent further abuse in the future. An identity that uplifts, not divides. Identity is more than a word or a concept. It's a history, a heritage, and it's a responsibility. But it's something that can't be built in isolation. It's profoundly linked to that of other peoples, other communities who share our territory and our values. Let's look at a recent example, the Algonquin and Métis of Ontario. In 2017, the Ontario government granted harvesting rights to groups who were claiming to be Métis without consulting the Algonquins, whose lands were directly affected. The government of Ontario even created an entity called the Algonquin of Ontario, AOO, and they're using it to avoid having the real conversations that they should be having with the Anishinaabe people on their territory, on the unceded territory that we're standing on right now. So imagine for a moment the Algonquins, who have an age-old relationship with these lands, were suddenly excluded from discussions about their own rights. This decision has created enormous tension, and it's shaken the trust that Indigenous communities have in institutions. In 2023, the Ontario Court of Appeal ruled in favour of the Algonquins, the real ones, and allowed them to sue the government. But this victory came after years of struggle, of frustration and losses that could have been avoided if the Algonquin people had been consulted from the very beginning. This case illustrates a broader reality. An identity cannot be defined without the recognition of the communities that are concerned. An identity must uplift, not divide. A philosophy of recognition must be put in place. Identity isn't just a personal choice. It's not something you can adopt or claim because it seems to be to your advantage or that you think you'll get reward from it. It's based on a fundamental principle, that of recognition. An identity must be recognized by those who truly bear it, by those who share its history and its responsibilities. The Métis of the Red River, the Inuit, the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and other First Nations have complex social and cultural networks, shared histories, and they have systems of governance that define who is part of their community. They know better than anyone who belongs to their community. They know their members, their families, their alliances. So when a person or a group claims an identity without being recognized by these communities, it poses a serious problem. It's not just a question of authenticity, it's also a question of respect. Take the case of the member for Edmonton Centre, a former federal cabinet minister. For years, he presented himself as Métis, claiming to be an adopted Cree without status. These claims turned out to be unfounded, undermining his credibility and the public's trust in our institution. For a minister, this gesture has raised very clear questions of ethics and questions of morality. This kind of claims not only harms the person making it, it's far from just a personal error, it harms real Indigenous communities who are robbed of opportunities and resources, whose narratives and legitimacy are stolen from them. I'd summarize by saying that stealing an identity is the same as stealing a voice. The real impact of identity appropriation It's not an abstract problem, Madam Speaker. It's something that's real, measurable, and often has devastating impacts on the communities that are affected. There's, the fact that resources that are intended for Indigenous communities are taken away from them, whether we're talking about grants, programs, or economic support. These resources are limited. When individuals or groups falsely claim identity, these resources are diverted from those who should be getting them. Imagine a young Métis, Inuit, or First Nations artist whose project is turned down because part of the funding that was available was allocated to somebody who doesn't really belong to their community. Imagine a family struggling to preserve its language or traditions, but is denied support because funds have been redirected to non-legitimate projects. This leads into the reinforcement of stereotypes. When an identity is abused, it's often oversimplified. What happens then is it feeds into stereotypes that fix Indigenous communities in caricatured roles. The spiritual Indigenous, the marginalized, or worse, the invisible. Far from enhancing these communities, these stereotypes reinforce inequality and discrimination and can lead to cultural erasure. One of the most insidious dangers of identity appropriation is cultural homogenization. When everything ends up looking the same, the unique characteristics of each culture are erased. Every language is forgotten, every ritual abandoned, every history is untransmitted, every story isn't passed along, and that's a loss for humanity as a whole. So the government responsibility is implicit here. All governments have a fundamental responsibility to protect the identities and rights of Indigenous peoples. This responsibility cannot be taken lightly, as every decision taken, or every decision that's neglected, has a profound impact on social cohesion, justice, and reconciliation. Governments must act with vigilance, transparency, and respect to ensure that their decisions do not perpetuate the injustices of the past. This requires clear, concrete measures, such as systematic consultations. Every decision affecting Indigenous rights or territories must be preceded by in-depth, respectful discussions with the nations concerned. These consultations are not a mere administrative exercise. They're essential to ensuring that the voices of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are at the heart of the decision-making process. There need to be clear criteria for recognition. Indigenous identities must be defined and recognized on the basis of solid historical evidence, authentic community ties, and explicit validation by the nations concerned. Without these criteria, there's a risk of diluting the integrity of Indigenous identity and of encouraging unwarranted claims on that identity. There also needs to be better protection of resources. Governments must ensure that funds and opportunities earmarked for Indigenous communities are defected to those who should benefit from them. This includes preventing abuse that divert these resources from their original purpose. When governments fail to fulfill these responsibilities, they fuel tensions, weaken legitimate claims, and undermine reconciliation efforts. To do otherwise is not only to betray the communities that are impacted, but also to undermine public trust in our institutions. It's imperative that governments rise to these challenges and act with determination to build a society where every identity is respected and valued. And this leads us to reflect on our own identity, Madam Speaker. In Quebec, we have a long history of fighting to preserve our language, our culture, and our rights. But this is a fight that must be undertaken with respect and humility. We can't defend our identity while ignoring or minimizing those of others. The true strength of an identity, whether it's a national or cultural identity, lies in its ability to coexist with others, to enrich and be enriched by different but complementary narratives and histories. The identity of the Quebec nation has never stood still. It evolves with the times, it's enriched by exchanges, and it reinvents itself in the face of contemporary challenges. Today, we live in a Quebec where cultural diversity, the demands of Indigenous peoples, and the struggle for social justice are redefining what it means to be a Quebecer. The legacy of the Patriotes, with their quest for freedom, equality, and sovereignty, remains a source of inspiration. But we need to go further. The contemporary question of Quebecois identity cannot be addressed without fully including the First Nations and the Inuit. Their history is intimately linked to ours, and their contribution to our collective culture is invaluable. We will always remember the Métis of the Red River Colony and the first of the premiers of Manitoba, Louis-David Riel. Quebecers supported him until his last breath and carried on the duty of collective memory that we share with the Métis of the Red River. In our increasingly globalized world, protecting our language, culture, and history must go hand in hand with a sincere openness to those with whom we share this land. Being a Quebecer today means embracing this duality, preserving what sets us apart while valuing the diversity that enriches us. We have a responsibility to build an identity that reflects not only our roots, but also our collective aspirations, an identity that includes, recognizes, and celebrates the wealth of all its components. That's how we can carry the legacy of the Quebec nation into the modern world. Minister's responsibility requires courageous political action. So to come back to the main subject, ministers as political leaders have a fundamental role to play in protecting identities. And they also have a role to play in correcting the mistakes of the past. This role goes beyond rhetoric and good intentions. It requires concrete, courageous action to restore equity and justice. Let's look at Bill C-53, for example. Bill C-53, as proposed, must be withdrawn. To maintain this bill would be to perpetuate injustices and further weaken the real claims of Indigenous communities. Withdrawing this bill, as the Métis and First Nations are calling for, would be more than a symbolic gesture. It would be an essential political action to show that we will not tolerate the misappropriation of identity. Furthermore, it's imperative to recognize the non-legitimacy of the 2023 agreement with the Métis of Ontario, the MNO. This agreement, based on fragile and contested foundations, has already created deep tensions with the First Nations and with genuine Métis communities. The federal government must send a clear message. It's time to break off talks, and this must be done immediately. The Métis National Council, once a representative body, no longer exists as a functional organization. In 2021, the Métis of Manitoba withdrew from the organization, followed in the spring of 2024 by the Métis of Saskatchewan. More recently, just last Friday, British Columbia also left the council, and the situation in Alberta is already on the desk of the Minister of Indigenous and Crown Relations. Clearly, this structure has become dysfunctional, and it can no longer serve as a legitimate interlocutor. This farce has gone on long enough. Ministers must show leadership by putting an end to these agreements and by re-establishing a transparent, respectful dialogue with the community's true representatives. The ministers responsible for Indigenous services, for Crown Relations, and for Northern Development undoubtedly have a central role to play in reconciliation efforts. However, it's imperative to recognize that this responsibility doesn't rest solely on their shoulders. We've repeatedly reminded them that some issues are beyond their jurisdiction and require the engagement of their cabinet colleagues. Reconciliation isn't a job that can be compartmentalized. It must cut across all departments, all sectors. The Minister of Public Safety must ensure that relations between law enforcement agencies and Indigenous communities are based on justice and respect. The Minister of Transport must take into account the realities of Indigenous territories and work to make sure that they have access to the rest of Canada. The Minister of Heritage must recognize and support Indigenous cultural initiatives to preserve and promote languages, arts, and stories. As for the Minister of Immigration, he has a duty to integrate Indigenous perspectives into reception policies, ensuring that newcomers understand and respect the rights and history of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And the list goes on. Each minister in his or her own field must actively contribute to reconciliation. Reconciliation isn't just an election promise. It's not just a budget line. It's a collective effort that requires coherence, collaboration, and unshakable political will. Everyone must play their role because only by acting together can we build a future that's based on mutual respect and justice. These decisions are not just political corrections. They're acts of responsibility. They're actions that show that we're serious about protecting the identity and rights of Indigenous peoples. To conclude, Madam Speaker, a shared and respected identity needs to be built to give promise for the future. Today, we've asked some crucial questions that impact all Indigenous nations. We've looked at the challenges around protecting identity and the injustices that have been too long ignored. We've reminded the government of its responsibilities, the responsibilities of ministers and all our institutions towards First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. But what we've done most of all is reaffirm a promise to not look away, to not abandon legitimate voices, and not to allow appropriation of identity to continue. We can't allow people to continue stealing stories, resources, and rights. Identity is a fundamental right. It's a right that demands not only to be protected, but also to be respected and valued. This respect must be at the heart of everything that we do, because our common future depends on it. I've invited the ministers to take courageous action in recognizing the identity of Indigenous nations. We have the power to write a new page of history together, a page that honors communities, respects their voices, and gives each person the dignity that they deserve. This work, Madam Speaker, can't wait any longer. It's time to act with determination and justice. Thank you, Miigwech, and I would add that the current case shows just how urgent it is that we create a register that would be recognized by and for First Nations, that it would be up to them, and I'll say it again, it's up to them to identify who are members of their communities, because when somebody, whether they be a minister or not, makes a claim of Indigenous identity and gets access to contracts, well, that doesn't create economic reconciliation. We can say that, 5% of government funds will be given in contracts for First Nations people if that money is constantly being diverted by people who are just checking a box on a form to say, well, I want to have access to this money because, in my opinion, I deserve it because I personally define myself as being Indigenous. We have a real social problem here, and I'll remind you of a fundamental issue, which is that reconciliation and economic reconciliation has to go through respect of First Nations and their right to define themselves, who they are. I can give more examples, Madam Speaker. When I was speaking about the Algonquin Association of Ontario, which was given the responsibility for projects like Chalk River, the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people who live around Chalk River all opposed this project like 140 municipalities did. But the reality is that there are fake Indigenous people who are not recognized by the Indigenous peoples, the real ones, who say, no, we recognize that this is a good economic project. And, we don't know what the agreements are. We don't even know who these people are. They're just people who've checked a box in a form to say, oh, I'm Indigenous. But they've usurped that identity, and this is creating a real problem in our society today because First Nations have to fight all the way to the Supreme Court to make sure their rights are respected, Madam Speaker. It has to end. Thank you, Miigwech.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's not that often that I would agree with many of the words from a member of the bloc, but in this case, I do, Madam Speaker. In fact, I highlighted a very special event that had taken place in Winnipeg, in downtown Winnipeg on Portage in Maine, just this past weekend, Madam Speaker, where we saw the Red River Métis Treaty signed off. The first time where a Métis is actually being recognized through a treaty. And David Chartrand and his government have done a great favor to our entire nation by continuously advocating for many, many years for this treaty. And it pleases me that as a government of Canada, after over close to 150 years, that we've achieved that. And if you were to check with whether it's David Chartrand or any other cabinet member, you will find clear unanimous support that it is the Métis that define who the Métis are. And I'm wondering if he could provide his thoughts on that issue.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for Winnipeg North for raising this issue. Yes, it's a historical case. The Indigenous Crown Relations Minister did recognize the leadership of the Métis of the Red River, and the leader, Chartrand, had good we had good conversations together, and I apologize once again for not being present last Saturday. I had a family obligation, something with my son, but that moment was obviously a historical one. And we have to recognize the true Métis, because it's so easy to say, to define yourself as a Métis. In Quebec, we dealt with this issue, and we have simplified relationship with Indigenous communities, and I invite Canada to think about this and also congratulate the Métis of Red River.
Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his intervention. I had the privilege of sitting with him on the INAN committee during the revisions of Bill C-61. And, you know, today we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about certainly the member from Edmonton Centre and his what's looking like identity fraud. And then the Conservatives using this whole situation to look like they're friends of Indigenous people when they're the farthest from. I would say I am deeply troubled with some of the positions the Conservatives have taken, even around the crisis and the ongoing genocide of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, where the former Prime Minister Harper said it wasn't on his radar. So I find it really violent now, a form of violence, usurping our identities for political points. I'm wondering what my honourable colleague thinks about that.
The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg Centre for her intervention. I'd like to pay tribute to her courage. She has been sitting at this House for several years and has been fighting for the respect of Indigenous people's rights. And it's through this that we can advance the debate, because for reconciliation to happen, we need the truth first. And it has to be sometimes yelled out, like institutions like ours, like the House of Commons. And it's example, we almost get, this member gives this example almost every day. And we have to rise and talked about this injustice that was happened with the member for Edmonton Centre when he usurped this identity to get a contract. This is scandalous, and if I was him, I would not just step down from the position of minister, but his legitimacy to be paid with funds as a member. Thank you. Questions and comments?
The honourable member for Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I am Métis. I am a citizen, a member in British Columbia, and I have many family members that are in the Edmonton area, and it's really affecting me closely. The fact that someone like the minister, the former Liberal minister, who tried to commit fraud, and it does not advance in any way the rights and the future of Indigenous peoples. I'm absolutely against what the NDP member said, saying that the Conservatives aren't in favor of Indigenous peoples and Métis peoples. We want Indigenous and Métis peoples, Inuit as well, to be prosperous. Does the member not agree that Indigenous peoples have the need as well to be prosperous across the country? Thank you. The honourable member for Abitibi. Do this in questions and comments.
Edmonton Grisba.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Désolé.
The honourable member for Shefford. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Abitibi for his speech and his Quebecois vision of this issue. Now, well, in his speech, he really did explain the problem of people who take part in programs who should be going to people in need. And the report in terms of women's for Indigenous women, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's not always obvious access to programs that they need. So we have people who are usurping identity, who take money from women the money that could go to Indigenous women to create companies, and who don't have enough money. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Yes, we have to denounce these type of situations. People get access to funds who don't deserve to because they're not Indigenous, and they're taking money from Indigenous women. So I'd like to, well, my colleague participated with me in an event of the NACA organization, who created assistant programs for entrepreneurs. They set up a committee of young people and women who want to participate in co-development meetings and coaching sessions. These are resources by and for Indigenous peoples that are working. So I would ask the government to multiply such initiatives to invest in development funds for and by Indigenous peoples. When we have resources like this that help young entrepreneurs who are women and Indigenous, so they can move forward in their knowledge and of their business, and that they will be able to harness Indigenous savoir-faire, knowledge, and to produce products that will be available in the market for the benefit of Quebecers. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Edmonton, Griswold.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And today I rise on behalf of a critical topic related not to just this place, but to Indigenous people right across the country. I do want to make mention of the fact that I'll be splitting my time with a very honourable member from Winnipeg Centre, to which not only is a champion in this place for Indigenous rights, but a champion for Indigenous people right across our planet. Madam Speaker, we're prepared to discuss a topic present to the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee related to the member from Edmonton Centre. The member from Edmonton Centre had falsely identified, or at least misled individuals, in particular the Liberal Party of Canada, in believing that he was Indigenous. For what purpose would one do this? Why would someone go about the process of undertaking identity fraud, identity theft, and taking from a people what is truly theirs and more? My sister, actually, when I mentioned this story to her, she said something really interesting to me. She said, "Oh, great. Someone wants to identify as Indigenous. That's fantastic. They should also face the consequences we do." Wow. Imagine that. My sister, a visible woman of color, not able to overcome the serious barriers that were present to her as a young person when trying to enter into business, when trying to enter into jobs, when trying to enter into a workplace where she was seen as a whole person. And the contrast that we're seeing here now present today is a contrast that's been extraordinarily exerted in the past few years. Buffy Sainte-Marie is an example of what is a really real and unfortunate circumstance facing Canadians, and that was a wake-up call to Canadians, a wake-up call to each and every one of us, that this kind of fraud, this pervasive fraud, this fraud that's so often not persecuted, not investigated, begs the question about why one does it, but also why one doesn't investigate it. Canada had 1,100 companies just deregistered. 1,100 companies have been delisted from the Federal Indigenous Procurement Registry, something that was made mention by the Indigenous Services Minister a few weeks ago. Wow, 1,100 were pre-approved as Indigenous companies for the purpose of procurement in the Government of Canada's Indigenous procurement strategy. Shameful that we were unable to designate, delist those 1,100 companies beforehand. This policy's been in place since the 90s. My God, what a failure of both Conservative and Liberal governments to have no care or concern about this issue for as long as this policy has been in existence. Worse yet, the Conservatives now cry wolf as if they were big stalwarts or big champions of Indigenous rights, Indigenous identity, when they were the government in charge at the time when this program had been operating. The Liberals inherit this problem and they keep it. A matter of convenience, a marriage of convenience, perhaps, one that's played out in Canada's history for the better part of 157 years, often at the detriment of Indigenous people. There's consequences to this kind of misbehavior, these kinds of crimes. We've seen in Nunavut, for example, 2 young people who were charged for 3 years in prison for taking Indigenous identity, Inuit identity, for the purposes of educational funding. Shameful. And now we see here in this great August chamber individuals unable to tell us truly who they are, but yet stand very proudly and profess who they are, without any ability to understand there are qualifiers to understanding that. There's frameworks. There's actually even court cases in Canada that Indigenous people have had to overcome in order to even see our own people identified and recognized. Vanderpeet, for example, a First Nations Supreme Court case that delineated who was First Nations for the purpose of commercial rights. Indigenous Métis people who've had to still today, since 2003, the Powley case, decide who is Indigenous. In all these cases, the court was deciding. How shameful is that the government was so unable to create a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship with those it literally legislated when it was part of their benefit, the Indian Act, for example. They knew who was Indigenous then. They knew who was Indigenous for the purpose of residential school. They knew who was Indigenous for the purpose of 60 Scoop. They knew who was Indigenous when it came to paying out treaty breaches, massive breaches in the agreements made by our ancestors. They knew who was Indigenous then. But now they don't. When they happen to be sitting in cabinet, all of a sudden, holy smokes, we couldn't even ask the guy. We're going to put him in our Indigenous caucus. We're going to label it as an Indigenous caucus, and we're going to call it the Fantastic 11. Today, we have questions about those individuals. We have questions about those who pose to be Indigenous for prestige, reputation, or access to funding. The reason why this is an important investigation to undertake is because that pain is felt deeply. The real victims here, some I'm sure would argue, particularly Liberals, is the member from Edmonton Centre. That's who they would argue the victim here is. The real victim is Indigenous people. It's Indigenous businesses. It's Indigenous communities that have done the hard work of organizing their community, creating a benefit impact study, talking to the community members, understanding what they can do as a community, create employment, only to be met with a rigged system here in Ottawa created by Liberals and Conservatives. The Liberals and Conservatives, they like to talk a big game on how they're big different parties, how different they are, but they've always benefited from being on the same side of the coin. When one does bad, the other one's elected and then does the bad thing again. Always, over and over and over and over, this tradition exists in Canada. There's rights. And the member from, the Liberal member says to join them. Who would join one of the most corrupt people ever elected in this country? The same people that legislated Indigenous people to having no water. And they're heckling an Indigenous member now. That's how disturbed they are by their own record. And now the good decency of the member from Winnipeg South is telling him, you know, we're going to lose on this, so you better not talk about it. And I appreciate that, because it's true. The Liberals have no clue how to engage Indigenous people unless a court is telling them how to do it. That's a true fact. And I beg my Liberal colleagues to look at that fact. Every single agreement comes through the narrow lens of the law. Because this government would rather debate who has rights in a matter of law, in the court of law, than to acknowledge Indigenous people are truly people that need recognition and rights in this place. That's the real shame of all this. And I've spoken to the government many times about this pervasive issue. The Minister of Indigenous Affairs, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, they all admit that Canada's system is like this. That, oh, we got to go to the courts, and then you'll come to us, and that's just the process. You got to prove to us that we have rights. No, I say, Canada, you prove to me you have rights.
That's right. Hear, hear.
You prove to Indigenous people why you think your laws are superficial to the Indigenous natural law that exists in this place. That's how far away we've come from this discussion, the true necessary pieces of this discussion. We fail to see a nation-to-nation relationship when we always come at it from this domestic point of view, that these nations lack the quality of sovereignty. They lack the quality of nationhood. They lack the quality of being able to assert for themselves self-determination. That kind of paternalism is sick. And it's over. This today is a warning. This discussion is a warning to pretendians everywhere. If you attempt to steal Indigenous people's identity for the purpose of reputation or funding, we will find you. And we will take from you everything you've sought to take from Indigenous people. And to Indigenous people who've suffered from these very obvious and long-standing cases of discrimination, know that a better future is possible. A better future is near us. The fact that we have young people who are right now engaged in these systems, who are innovating, who are learning their language, who are coming back to land, who are doing the hard work of reconnecting of who they really are, that is a blessing. Madam Speaker, we have a great blessing just ahead of us. It's the generation to come right after me. Those young Indigenous people are fierce. They're warriors, they're strong, and I'm proud of them. So deeply proud of them. And I can't wait till they fill this chamber with their voices, with their stories, and bring true justice and true accountability to this country. We need to see that future, Madam Speaker. The future is promising. The future is with our Indigenous youth, and the future will be one where our dignity, our stories, and who we are truly met. And this beautiful planet has an opportunity then to hopefully share with all of us its opportunities that Indigenous people will make present for everyone.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would like to highlight something I've already highlighted a little bit earlier during the discussion on this, and that is the Red River Métis Treaty, an agreement that was actually achieved, a historical event for the Manitoba Métis government, Madam Speaker. You're talking well over 150 years, and through the leadership of President Chartrand and his cabinet and ongoing discussions with this government, we have the first ever treaty, Métis Treaty. And I see that as a very strong positive. As I see the many different calls for action of those where the federal government is responsible for. It's well over 80% that are well underway, many of them actually been done. This is a government that has invested and worked directly with Indigenous communities across this country. And, my challenge to the member would be, could he cite a government that has done as much as this government has in raising the profile of this important issue?
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Griswold.
The greatest government to ever help Indigenous people is our own governments, our own people's governments. I've served my own people's government. I served as the National Director for the Métis Settlements General Council as the National Director. And the member cites a historic treaty that was just signed. And in my speech, if you had listened, I had told them every single agreement that reaches a Liberal's desk is one that's been forced down their throat by the court. Yeah. The MMF's decision was one. Open your phone, look at it, Google it. It's called the 2013 Supreme Court case, Manitoba Métis Federation, that just signed a treaty, and Canada, citing Canada in breach of the 1870 Manitoba Constitution that my ancestors died for. They paid the ultimate price. For this member to lecture me now, over 100 years later, a descendant of those people, those brave men who died for that province, to then tell me that it was not a court case, I challenge him to read the MMF and Canada Supreme Court case.
The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And to the member, it's super disappointing. You know, when this Liberal government got elected, they said the nation...
Sorry to interrupt the Honourable Member. I'm sorry to... Can we allow the Honourable Member who is trying to ask a question to be heard. Order. Order. The Honourable Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, it's super disappointing to see that the Liberal government, who said the nation-to-nation relationship was the most important priority, and then we see they haven't solved boiled water advisories. We see that the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations that the Stephen Harper government recommended, there's been very little progress. And then we see hardly any action on murdered and missing Aboriginal women. And so, to me, it just is. Now we have criminal charges that are up against ministers of the Crown, and ministers of the Crown misrepresenting. So could the member opposite comment on his disappointment in these events?
Member for Edmonton Grisba.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I am disappointed. I'm disappointed by consecutive Liberal and Conservative governments who always use Indigenous people as a gambling chip. Whether it's Conservatives that today are using Indigenous people as a gambling chip to own the Libs, or whether it's the Liberals who consistently neglect their responsibility for Indigenous people. Both are immense travesties in this place. When it comes to clean water, the member mentions that I will want to correct the record on the history of clean water. The reason why we're debating clean water legislation today is because the Conservative government of the past was litigated in court, and that was deemed inappropriate. It was deemed illegal. And so the Conservatives were attempting to take control over Indigenous people water, and the court said, no way. And now the Liberals are coming with another inferior piece of legislation that's almost identical to the Conservatives' piece of legislation. That's the problem that exists when it comes to clean water. When it comes to Truth and Reconciliation, we had witnessed the largest Indigenous protest in Canada's history called Idle No More in order to kick Stephen Harper to the curb. Indigenous people did that. We stood on our rights. We stood on the shoulders of giants that led the way, our ancestors in particular, that will never, ever allow us to see dignity or pride ever again.
Très brève question, honorable député.
A very brief question, the member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to commend my colleague on his speech and the energy he puts into it, because the issue of funding and Indigenous identity, a number of committees have unfortunately dealt with this. And I say unfortunately because we have recurring problems with public accounts, and the member was particularly active on his committee. So I'd like to hear what he has to say about the generalized problem when it comes to Indigenous identity and contracts going to the wrong people rather than to genuine Indigenous people. A brief answer.
If it's possible, Madam Speaker, with the most important information to that member's question. There are 3 requirements under law in this country that must be observed in the application or support or benefit, which is identified by the law, which is 3-point test. And I'll make it easy for everybody. I can't do it in slogan format for my Conservative colleagues, but I'll try my best. 1, you must self-identify as an Indigenous person. I, Blake, the member from Edmonton Grisba, identifies as Métis. You need to pass a second test, which is you must have a historic connection to that community. My ancestors, we have a big fancy sheet that tells where we're from, we have a historic connection to that same nation. This is the 3rd test that very few people can pass, that the modern iteration of that community accepts you. The Métis settlements, I'm from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement, accepts me as a member. Those 3 qualifiers together, under the Supreme Court of Canada, as Pally, give us that ability to understand.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I have to say I'm not pleased to rise today to participate in a debate about a concurrence motion about the member from Edmonton Centre usurping, appropriating Indigenous identity for financial benefit. And I have to say what's been most disturbing is, well, my good colleague, an expert on Métis rights, stood here just now talking about Métis rights. The member from Kingston and the Islands felt it appropriate to heckle him. The height of white supremacy that we regularly see in the House, and I can say that.
The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands on a point of order.
I almost feel as though this is to entice a reaction out of me. But I did not heckle anybody. The member from Winnipeg and I were just having a conversation. I didn't even raise my voice, Madam Speaker.
That is, yes, that may be debate or clarification, but we will let the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre pursue her speech. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
And the member from Kingston and the Island, again, when we're talking about the usurping of Indigenous voices and identity, what does he do? He decides to do a point of order when an Indigenous woman is talking. The height, again, I will say, of white supremacy. And then the member from Winnipeg North, the Liberal from Winnipeg North, oh, here we go.
The honourable member for Winnipeg North. As for the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I'm concerned in regards to the direction that the member is trying to intentionally label members of the government. She stands up on many points of order to interrupt other individuals and to try to give any sort of false impression that this is something that's anti-Indigenous is just wrong and unethical.
Well, the honourable member for Hamilton Centre on the same point of order, but the honourable member, members will allow the chair to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do appreciate that. You know, they're going to keep on standing up to interrupt her with. I would at least ask for you that they cite the point of order that they're raising and apply the relevance to their point of order.
Same to the honourable member, but I do. Can I? Actually, that is a rule that applies to everyone. Well, before asking for a point of order, it is important that to mention which point of order the members are referring to. But to go back to the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre, it would be perhaps good not to try to accuse other members of being what the honourable member was accusing them.
So the member, and I'm going to go back to my point that he didn't allow me to finish, and then the member of Winnipeg North, instead of learning from an expert, an actual descendant of the Red River Métis, he heckles him during his response when he could take the time, a time of reconciliation, truth, to learn.
Shameful.
Shameful. And it is unfortunate that at a time when the Liberal Party should be standing in solidarity, if they're really serious about reconciliation, to protect Indigenous people from the robbing and stealing of our identities, that they double down. They double down and they heckle. Well, they're not going to take away my voice.
Hear, hear.
So this is what I have to say. It is disgusting what has occurred. It is disgusting what has occurred for a number of reasons, Mr. Speaker. Because this member has used Indigenous identity potentially for financial gain. And here's the sad part about people like him, people like Buffy St. Marie, people like the many academics who have gotten scholarships and grants and bursaries as a longtime academics that used our identity to get millions of dollars in research grants. They financially benefit, but they don't have to deal with the kinds of things that we do as Indigenous people, like the intergenerational impacts of residential school, like the fact that we have an ongoing genocide against Indigenous women and girls so severe in the city of Winnipeg that I fear the safety of my nieces taking taxi cabs in the city of Winnipeg. And in the midst of this debate, when they have an opportunity to give space to Indigenous voices, they disrespected that. But it's not just the Liberals. It's the weeks and weeks and weeks that I've had to listen to the Conservatives also usurp Indigenous identities for political gain. disgusting. And I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, why this is so grotesque. Because it was a Conservative government with Prime Minister Harper that said murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls was not on his radar. It was the current member of Carleton who said to residential school survivors when settlement agreements were being reached, oh, they don't need the money, they need to learn the value of hard work. Like being a slave in the residential schools doing tasks every day wasn't hard work, being taken away from your families, to then fundraise with residential school denialist think tanks, or lift up his friend Jordan Peterson, a misogynist, a transphobe, and a residential school denialism, protecting in public time and time again freedom of speech. Well, inciting hate, Mr. Speaker, we have laws in this country, the criminal code. Inciting hate is inciting hate. This has nothing to do with speech, and time again, the leader of the Conservative Party has fraternized and even fundraised with folks like Frontier Centre, residential school denial think tanks for the Conservative Party of Canada. Fundraising with Frontier Centre when he came to Winnipeg, when we had just discovered the tragic news that there were women potentially in the Prairie Green landfill, women that we are currently looking for. Didn't go see the families. No. He decided instead to fundraise with residential school denying think tanks. And the member from Saskatoon West, who likened Indigenous people with criminality, likened women, saying he was more likely to offend, he said, because of his racial background. And then doctored the Hansard. Doctored the Hansard to suit his political benefit. So I get kind of sick and tired coming as a representative from a place that has been likened as ground zero for MMIWG. I get really sick and tired when I come from a family who's had to deal with the intergenerational effects of child welfare systems and institutionalization, to hear Conservatives, people who have voted unanimously time and time again against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, showing this deep concern for the latest identity fraud from the Liberals. So yeah, point of order. I hadn't even started talking. Point of order. It reeks here of appropriating Indigenous identities for personal benefit and gain. Whether it's the Liberals and members trying to get loans, or the Conservatives utilizing our trauma, our historical experiences, so that they can hold up the House forever on our backs. I wish they had fought so hard for residential school survivors. I wish they had fought so hard to get support for families of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. I wish they fought so hard for our land, territories, and resources, not when it suited their economic and political interests, but to uphold our human rights. Human rights that they have voted against time and time again in this House, voted against C-15. So if we're going to get to the bottom of this, then if we're going to reconcile in this country, Let's do some reconciling here. Let's tell some truth bombs here about the level of baloney and racism on the backs of Indigenous people that I and my other Indigenous colleagues
recognizing me out of turn there. I appreciate it, because the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre deserves all our respect and our deep appreciation for her championing, for her work on behalf of Indigenous women and girls, yes, but I would say for marginalized people.
From Saanich Gulf Islands for the question. I think one of the things that I've started the NDP who has respected my voice as an Indigenous person, understanding that maybe sometimes my voice might be different. A deep respect from our leader and my colleagues who have supported us.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as a Métis citizen of Métis, and so we see the amount of fraud for economic and social and if the member would agree with me how just how this has hurt the Indigenous people.
The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
You know what? What's happened is disgusting with the member from Edmonton Centre, but I'll tell you what else is disgusting equally for me is the way the Conservatives are also hijacking indigeneity and Indigenous identity for political gain. And I'll tell you how I know, for all the reasons I cited. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, something they were against. They're voting against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The fact that the current leader is fundraising with residential school denialists and buddying up with Jordan Peterson, who is also a residential school denialist.
I guess we get a point of order, Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge.
I take this as an attack upon me personally. And my family attended residential schools, and as a Conservative,
okay, that says we're in the debate. We'll go on. Order. Order. Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Shefford. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Winnipeg for her speech, and we sit on the same committee. We have, had the opportunity to work together for some time now, and I'll try to be brief today. All these appropriations of fake Indigenous identity that we've been talking about today, and we see people who have access to funds, and they're taking away funds that could be used for reconciliation and nation-to-nation dialogue. And my colleague knows this. At our committee, we have study after study that's come by that's confirmed that we need programs for example, Indigenous women who are disproportionately affected by resource exploitation in the West. She knows that very well. She brought that study before committee, whether it be for the Red Dress movement. We need more programs for help in that area. We need more funds to help support women who want to be economically self-sufficient and put in place the recommendations from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report. I'd like to hear her speak about those issues.
Remaining the honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Well, I'd just like to thank my honourable colleague who's actually been a tremendous ally. I have to say the Status of Women Committee and the kind of support that I've had from women in the House of Commons that have worked across party line. I'd like to commend my honourable colleague for her support, especially in things like the Red Dress Alert, especially with things like the connection between increased violence against Indigenous women and girls and resource extraction projects. I know I'm out of time, Mr. Speaker, but I'd just like to thank my colleague.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sharing my time with the member from Coquitlam for Coquitlam. I know that he has some prepared remarks on this particular subject, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why I think we're debating this today. But I think it's important just to bring everybody back to the same place to read what it is exactly that we're debating. This is a concurrence motion. It is a motion that came from committee and that the Conservatives have tabled today. And the motion reads that the committee report to the House that the MP from Edmonton Centre appear before the committee for 2 hours independently on Friday, December 6th, immediately following the completion, and report back of C61 to the House, and that the report is tabled by the Chair in the House as soon as possible and no later than Monday, November 25th, 2024. They then further amended this, the Conservatives, to say that it come to return from committee by January the 25th. And so that's what we're debating. That is what 3 hours of House time has been seized with, is to debate whether or not the minister, the member who is the MP from Edmonton Centre, go and appear before committee on this particular day for this allotted amount of time, and how it be reported back to this House. That's what the Conservatives chose to use. And the reason why I bring this up is because, like so many times throughout this fall session that we have debated this issue specifically, or these issues specifically about procedural tactics, Conservatives are doing this time and time again. And I find it very discouraging, because there are so many other things that we could be talking about, so many other issues that we could be discussing. But instead, we revert back to Conservative go-tos of character assassinations and trying to drag people through the mud, because that's the only way that this Conservative Party feels as though it can ever get elected, Mr. Speaker, is not to present its ideas to Canadians, but rather to repeatedly and ad nausea just try to create and inflict maximum personal damage on individual reputations. And it doesn't even have to be an elected official. They will stop at nothing. They will go after renowned Canadians, as we saw last spring. They will go after just about anybody that they see, that they think that they can get a little bit of political game out of. And that's what we're seeing today again. The member from Edmonton Centre, who was a minister, stepped back. He defended himself and said that the allegations against him were not true. He stepped back and he said, I want to clear my name and I want to take time to do that, and I will step back from the ministry in the meantime. And that's exactly what he did. But it's not, that's not enough. It's an honorable way to approach this. That's not enough for Conservatives. They need to absolutely absolutely go after this until they've drawn as much possible blood out of this situation as possible. And I find it so discouraging, and I believe that the majority of Canadians do too. But you got to ask yourself, what do they not want to be talking about, Mr. Speaker? You know, some fairly, substantial bombshell allegations that have been dropped in the recently. You know, the member from Calgary, Nose Hill, is being implicated in a CBC story recently about having been pressured by foreign diplomats to abandon Patrick Brown's leadership campaign in a leadership race that eventually elected the current leader of the opposition to that position. Now, here's something even more remarkable, Mr. Speaker. Moments ago, not that long ago, the member from Calgary Nose Hill was in a committee room. She was approached by the media, and she jumped up and ran out. There's video of it all over the internet right now. She jumped up, ran out. This is, by the way, the member that said not too long ago, she referred to herself, I have to find it here in the story, she said that she was a seasoned politician and a seasoned communicator. That's what she said. Those were her words. And she couldn't handle the heat of the media coming up to her in a committee room, and she got up and she ran out of the committee room. I mean, I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but when I see something like that, the first thing I think of is somebody's trying to hide something. And it's interesting because she made some comments that are in that story. She said, I left the Patrick Brown campaign on my own volition. I was not pressured. I'm a seasoned politician, a seasoned communicator. I know how to handle myself. She certainly does. She certainly does, because she handled herself very well in that comment alone. She skated right by the main issue. The issue is not whether or not the member from Calgary Nose Hill was changed her mind as a result of a conversation. That's not the issue. The issue is not even, believe it or not, whether or not she was coerced by a foreign diplomat. That's not the issue either. What the actual issue is, and what she completely neglects to say because of her incredible communication skills that she rightly points out that she has, she neglected
the honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while I understand and appreciate that there is a decent amount of latitude given to us here in this chamber, what the member is talking about is not on the issue at hand about the member from Edmonton Centre and his egregious claims of Indigenous identity to try and get government contracts. And therefore, I do believe that this is a call on relevance.
I thank the honourable member for the input, and I will caution the honourable member to tie it back as best as he can to the topic at hand. The honourable member for Kingston Edmonds.
I assure you I will be coming back in a moment, Mr. Speaker, but I mean, I can't say that I'm surprised that a Conservative would get up and try to silence me when I'm making these comments. I mean, the issue here is not whether the member from Calgary Nose Hill was influenced, or whether or not the member from Calgary Nose Hill was able to stand up and, the issue.
And as I said previously, tie it back quickly. The honourable member for Kingston Edmonds.
And I tried to, but I was only given 10 seconds before I was shut down again by a Conservative. The issue is that the member from Calgary Nose Hill has neglected to inform us whether or not she was approached by a foreign diplomat. That's foreign interference. That's what the Canadian public deserves to know, not what her end result was as a result of that.
Another point of order from the element for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
That was far more than 10 seconds, Mr. Speaker. I'm trying to give him some time, but he refuses to bring this back to the debate at hand.
And I think on the same point of order, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, absolutely. Mr. Speaker, I think the member needs to be a little bit patient, and let me explain why. What the motion that the Conservatives have actually amended calls for the member from Edmonton Centre to go before a standing committee. If the member is patient enough, what she'll hear is that there is merit for the member from Calgary Nose Hill also to be going before a committee and to draw the comparison. It is absolutely relevant in terms of drawing that comparison. She might not like the comparison.
Okay, well, we are descending far into debate here. I will say again that relevance is important in this chamber, that we do want to be talking about the issue that's at hand, which is, of course, this report. But ultimately, I know the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands will at least say 3 words to connect it back like the Parliamentary Secretary just did.
I'll do that right now, Mr. Speaker. And I did start my speech by talking exactly about what this report said. I read out the report. And to the Parliamentary Secretary, to his point, he kind of gave away where I was going with this, but this is exactly it. You know, this is a committee report that is calling a minister to go and appear before a committee. But yet we can't even, a former minister, thank you for that correction, we can't even get the truth out of some we can't, I'll rephrase that because I don't want to be doing something I can't do indirectly. We can't even seem to get members of this House who potentially have information to go before committee.
That's right.
So my point is, as it relates to this report, is this double standard that Conservatives seem to be placing. On the one hand, they're saying, we absolutely need to get to this minister appearing before committee. That's what this whole entire report is about. I apologize to my colleague from Conservatives if she feels as though I'm not staying on topic. This is literally just 2 sentences that we're debating. That's what this is. And we're debating whether or not the minister should be dragged before committee. And we know that we just had to drag Patrick Brown to public safety. He has to be there before December the 10th. And all I'm saying is maybe that should be extended to the member from Calgary Nose Hill too, because she seems to have some information that I bet you the committee wants to get down to. So I'm sure that my colleagues on Conservatives are equally concerned about the member from Calgary Nose Hill, as they are in this motion that they tabled today in this House. So, Mr. Speaker, I end with where I started, which is that Mr. Speaker, I end with where I started, which is that I believe that this is nothing more than an attempt for Conservatives to drag people that have already admitted and have already stated their position and admitted that they're going to remove themselves from the position that they're in order to clear their name. And we have to let that process unfold. And therefore, I am very much content with the manner in which it is been dealt with. I feel as though there is an opportunity for the minister or the former minister to provide his position on what has transpired. Then I believe is the best time for everyone to judge him.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for North Okanagan, Shuswap.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They can't stand the truth. They couldn't handle it. That's why we've been in a state of limbo, and there's been no government legislation debated in this House for weeks, because their Prime Minister and their party of this chamber. And yet he tries to deflect the fault to this side of the House when it is that side of the House that has been consistently found, I'll say, in review of this House's order, and with the continued cover-up of corruption, whether it was the SNC-Lavalin scandal years ago that saw the dismissal and of an honored member or as it continues today, on and on and on. He continues to try to deflect. Why?
The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Well, he almost executed that as well as Jack Nicholson did in A Few Good Men, but not quite. But I will say to the member, thank you. Thank you for at least admitting that this concurrence motion is nothing more than trying to prolong the filibuster that they're doing on the former motion that we've been dealing for months. He said that. He just said that in his comments. What he said is he said, we're doing this because we're trying to hold the government account for X, Y, and Z, and mention nothing about this report. So all I can say is thank you. Thank you.
I think a point of order, the honourable member for Brandon Souris.
My honourable member across the way has putting words in my colleague's mouth from BC here, and
I think we're just depending into the debate we're having. Maybe if we get another round, I'll let the honourable member for Brandon Souris ask a question. Question, come on.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to my colleague's speech, and well, I still have a question. Does he approve of his Liberal colleague from Edmonton Centre? Does he think he did the right thing? Does he think that there shouldn't be any consequences, that he's using Indigenous identity when he shouldn't? Mr. Speaker, I'd like to hear my colleague's thoughts on that. The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
I said at the end of my speech, if the member was listening, Mr. Speaker, was that, and I said it in the speech, in my speech as well earlier on, the member from Edmonton has defended himself and said that what he's being accused of is not true, and he removed himself from cabinet in order to defend his reputation and in order to clear his name. So rather than jump to the judgment that my friend across the way wants to jump to, I would rather wait until he has the opportunity to do that, see how that comes out, and then we can decide whether or not we want to tar and feather him.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton-Griesbach.
Mr. Speaker, earlier in the post-election of 2015 and again in 2019, the Liberal Party itself had published a document claiming it had 11 Indigenous MPs. Included was the former Minister of Employment and Social Development, the member from Edmonton Centre. Why is it that does this member think the Liberals did that?
The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Well, for the same reason that all political parties will identify various different people with various different backgrounds, for example, I think that's why this was done. Now, I guess the issue at heart here is whether or not, and I think that this is what I'm reading between the lines here, is that the member from Edmonton was in error by doing that, and he shouldn't have done that. That's what I'm hearing, and that's what is out there. But all I'm saying is, he says that that's not the case. He wants to clear his name. He stepped back from some of his responsibilities in order to do that. Why don't we give him the opportunity to try that? And then if it doesn't come out and it comes out that in fact that he was being egregious in his statements, then hold him to account at that point. Why the rush to judgment right now?
Still time for a very quick question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Governor Nussey.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if my colleague can just amplify or talk about the two systems, the Conservatives versus what they do with Liberals versus the member from, let's say, Calgary Nose Hill.
The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
Well, and this was the amazing thing that we saw earlier today with the question from the member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman. You couldn't have seen a double standard on display better than that question. Basically saying, well, hold on. She said that she didn't do it. We need to believe her. And meanwhile, when the member from Edmonton says, hold on, I'm being misrepresented in the way this is, everybody jumps on top of him. And I'm just saying, why can't we apply the same standard to everybody? The member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman showed exactly how he can't do that.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want first to recognize that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Mr. Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the valuable work the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs has carried out by examining the infrastructure deficit confronting many Indigenous communities. The report prepared by the committee titled A Path to Growth, Investing in the North provides important insights into the challenges facing infrastructure development and maintenance in the North and helpfully recommends potential solutions for them. The report will help to inform policy and program decisions going forward. Common themes from this report are core to how we are proactively addressing challenges in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Following their lead, we are working to remove systematic barriers to economic development and to advance Indigenous economic self-determination. Before outlining some of the many ways we are making progress, however, I must respond to misleading statements being made in today's debate and set the record straight. As members of government have repeatedly made clear, Global Health Imports was never listed on the Indigenous Business Directory. Consequently, the company has not ever been part of the government's procurement program for Indigenous businesses, nor was it awarded any contracts through the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. Instead, I want to bring the focus back to tangible activities that are producing real results in the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples. Together with Indigenous leaders, Indigenous business, and the broader sector, we are working to advance economic reconciliation. On this note, this past year, Indigenous Services Canada convened 2 economic reconciliation roundtables, which were attended by leaders from national Indigenous organizations and national Indigenous economic institutions, senior executives from Canada's financial sector, federal ministers, and senior federal officials. Indigenous peoples are leading the way to advance economic reconciliation. And what this level of engagement at the roundtables demonstrates is that economic reconciliation is not a conversation limited to government, but there are also commitments and buy-in from the financial sector to advance common goals. By supporting self-determined economic priorities and collaborating with leading economic thinkers across Canada, we will continue to drive toward concrete solutions, concrete actions, and concrete solutions that will make a difference in the everyday lives of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The roundtables have advanced a common understanding of how public and private sector actions can help to remove access to capital barriers. Participants brought forward ideas experts to address data gaps through the publishing of Indigenous economic outlooks. Partners are challenging us to reimagine how to develop these outlooks, with opportunities to blend traditional economic indicators with their economic priorities. There are many opportunities to support exciting Indigenous visions. This is not the only way we are advancing economic reconciliation. Various economic development programs have been designed to support improved economic outcomes. For example, the Aboriginal economic opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Over the past 35 years, the program has distributed roughly 52,000 business loans worth $3.2 billion through its access to capital stream 3.6 million is produced in total gross domestic product for Canada. That's an impressive return on investment. Most beneficial it is sustaining the network of Indigenous lending institutions, creating and expanding Indigenous businesses, and creating or maintaining jobs through lending. That's not the only example of economic reconciliation in action. The Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program, which I've just talked about, is actually led by and delivered through the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, NACCA, and the Métis Capital Corporations. It is highly significant that a program put in place to enable First Nations, Inuit, and Métis business owners to launch or grow their businesses is also led by strong Indigenous leaders. The National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association and the Métis Capital Corporations administer about $25 million per year of equity capital provided by the Government of Canada to enable Indigenous entrepreneurs to obtain affordable commercial loans. This Indigenous-led program shows what success looks like when Indigenous peoples are supported and empowered to independently deliver services. The Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program also supports the $150 million Indigenous Growth Fund. This Indigenous-led and designed fund is providing Indigenous businesses with a fully independent source of capital. The procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses, which I mentioned earlier, is another initiative producing positive economic results for Indigenous people. It facilitates access to federal procurement opportunities so that Indigenous businesses can win contracts, generate revenue, and gain experience that in turn can assist them with winning larger future contracts within both the public and private sectors. What we have heard from Indigenous leaders is that they want the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses to stay. It continues to evolve and adapt to changing needs and fiscal realities, in large part because we are listening to Indigenous leaders and businesses. The resulting feedback from procurement roundtables held with Indigenous leaders since 2018 directly led to improvements to the strategy, which is why our relationships with Indigenous partners are so important. Our programs, policies, and services must apply Indigenous insights, lessons learned, and expertise, and that is exactly what we're doing. These efforts have accelerated since 2021, when we began to co-develop a transformative Indigenous procurement strategy with Indigenous partners. This 5-year process is currently underway, and these reforms will improve existing Indigenous procurement policies and programs. Furthermore, they will help ensure that benefits intended for Indigenous people go to Indigenous peoples. An important part of this collaborative work includes determining a path forward to transferring the administration of the Indigenous Business Directory to Indigenous partners. One key message delivered by partners in our co-development discussions is that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are best positioned to define and verify Indigenous businesses. Indigenous Services Canada is committed to working with partners, including the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, Inuit Tapirita Katatami, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association, and the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business to transfer the verification of Indigenous businesses to Indigenous partners. We know that economic opportunities for Indigenous businesses were removed from or blocked through years of colonial policies and practices. The concrete actions taken by the Government of Canada in cooperation and partnership with Indigenous leaders and businesses must continue. We need the valuable insights and expertise of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit leaders. We need continued opportunities for meaningful dialogue, and we need reports like A Path to Growth, Investing in the North, that shine a light on the work ahead. This is economic reconciliation in action, when we collaborate on efforts to support and empower Indigenous people to fully and equitably participate, whether as small business owners or leaders of major projects in the economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, what the Liberals are telling us, it's as if nothing really to see here, but there's still the pretending to use the Indigenous identity, and even they've said themselves that they don't recognize them we had a situation last year that also took place with the member for Nickerbelt Sudbury, if I remember correctly, his writing name. And I'm looking forward to see what will happen. Can the member, Coquitlam, agree? Does he agree with the fact that the member for Edmonton Centre has to go to committee as quickly as possible to answer questions from parliamentarians and to be accountable for the situation of having used public funds inefficiently, and also to be responsible and accountable? I'd like to hear what he has to say about that. Thank you. The honourable member for Coquitlam.
I've heard the member from Edmonton Centre speak on this matter. He has assured me that there is no wrongdoing behind what has gone forward. There has been some confusion in his family history. He is sorting that out, and I have full confidence in him to do the right thing and to clear his name as we go forward.
In comments, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And honestly, I can't believe what the member has said. There's still boiled water advisories, even though this government said that the nation-to-nation relationship was the most important. There's been very little action on truth and reconciliation, no action to speak of on murdered and missing Aboriginal women. And so is the member not embarrassed that a minister of the Crown had to step down under allegations that he misrepresented his Indigenous heritage?
The honourable member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
I have to say that the member from Edmonton Centre is not responsible for allegations that amount mainly to innuendo and smear against him. I would say that in regard to water advisories and so forth, that we committed to getting rid of almost all of them by 2021. We did get rid of almost all of them by 2021. But it's an ongoing issue that we work continuously with the various First Nation communities to resolve.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Rosemount La Petite Patrie. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. While the objective of giving 5% to companies from First Nations is obviously a laudable one with respect to reconciliation, but we know that there are 1,100 companies removed from the list because there was some things that were wrong, and people are trying to fraud the system and misappropriate funds, even though they're not from First Nations. And this comes from so high up that even the former minister, the member for Edmonton Centre, who was in a controversy about the fact that he was a pretendian, and his company did so to get federal contracts in his own government. Does my colleague not find this absolutely scandalous?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I object to the characterization of the member as a pretendian. As mentioned in my speech, his company received no funding through any Indigenous stream whatsoever. The member is a man of honor and good reputation, and I have full confidence that he will be able to restore his reputation as we go forward.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader. Quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm wondering if the member would share the same concern I have in regards to how the Conservative Party is bringing forward concurrence motions as a way to filibuster so that we're not debating other issues that are of critical importance for all Canadians. And what they're doing is they're always wanting to provide the report, go back to the committee, and give a specific instruction to the committee. And we're seeing more and more of that. My concern is I believe that these standing committees should be able to determine whether or not they would like to be able to have who coming before the committee for testimony. Does he have any concerns in terms of how much of a control freak or a control the leader of the Conservative Party wants to have over standing committees?
Very few seconds left. The Honourable Member for Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam.
Thank you. I agree with my colleague. I do believe that these motions are a matter of an extended filibuster, and I do believe that the standing committees ought to maintain control of their own business. This is an end run around the notion that we cannot compel members to appear, but I think it's uncontestable that this is a matter of slowing down the House so that they can claim that it's broken.
Reprise de débat, continuing debate. The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Edmonton Centre has a lot to answer for. He has a lot to answer for, notwithstanding the fact that he recently resigned from cabinet in disgrace. Among the serious matters that the member must answer for and be held accountable for is the fact that his shady pandemic profiteering PPE company falsely held itself out to be a wholly owned Indigenous company when it applied for 2 federal government contracts. It was a blatant attempt to give the company's bids a leg up in the government's procurement selection process. In other words, it was an attempt to steal contracts, government contracts, from legitimately owned Indigenous businesses. It's about as low as it gets. It's cultural appropriation in one of its most offensive forms. And you know what else it is, Mr. Speaker? It's fraud. It's outright fraud. And the Prime Minister knew about the fact that the minister's company had falsely represented itself in this way, and for days the Prime Minister stood behind the minister. He kept him in his cabinet. It was only when the Edmonton police officially announced that a criminal investigation had been launched into the member's company that he finally resigned from cabinet. But I have to say, it isn't just that the Prime Minister, as bad as it was to stand behind the minister for days, the Prime Minister has stood behind the member for months, despite the fact that he faced a cloud of corruption that involved the fact that he almost certainly violated the Conflict of Interest Act while he was involved in the operations of the shady PPE company while he sat in cabinet. That is a situation where the member broke the law, and text messages revealed that a Randy was involved in the operations, was in fact involved in a $500,000 shakedown, and no one can identify the other Randy other than the member for Edmonton Centre. And that didn't stop the Prime Minister from standing by the member for Edmonton Centre. Likewise, the member's company had been ordered by Alberta courts to pay back clients $8 million for ripping them off, and faces not less than 7 lawsuits alleging fraud. And that wasn't enough to kick him out of cabinet, nor was the fact that the minister falsely held his company as being wholly Indigenous owned in applying for 2 government contracts. A normal Prime Minister, in fact any other Prime Minister, would have long said to the member for Edmonton Centre, "You're fired, you're out of cabinet."
That's exactly right.
But this is not a normal Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who has presided over a culture of corruption and conflict that goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister himself. And I have to ask, was the Prime Minister's reluctance to fire the member for Edmonton Centre related to the fact that this is a Prime Minister who has been found guilty not once but twice of none other than breaking the Conflict of Interest Act? Could the Prime Minister's reluctance also have had something to do with the fact that he is, like the member for Edmonton Centre, a cultural appropriator? This is a Prime Minister who has worn blackface more times than he can recall. This is a Prime Minister who has repeatedly worn highly inappropriate and culturally insensitive costumes, including while serving as Prime Minister. Could it be that the Prime Minister was reluctant to fire the member for Edmonton Centre for such things as breaking the Conflict of Interest Act and being a cultural appropriator, because by that standard, not only would the Prime Minister have to fire the member for Edmonton Centre, he'd also have to fire himself. I would submit that a strong inference in the affirmative can be drawn in that regard. And with respect to the member for Edmonton Centre and the fact that his company falsely represented itself as being wholly Indigenous owned, the member's excuse is that he had no idea, that it was all the fault of his business partner, Anderson. Well, let me observe that the member for Edmonton Centre has repeatedly and disturbingly held himself out to be Indigenous. This is a member who once said that he was Métis, then he said he was non-status adopted Cree, then he said he wasn't Indigenous at all, but an ally of Indigenous peoples, and now I believe he is purporting again to be Métis. Maybe he's not. It's tough to keep track given all of the representations over the years that the member for Edmonton Centre has made about his Indigenous status, which in fact he doesn't have. And I have to also observe that I've listened to that member make those representations. I can remember when he sat over there between 2015 and 2019, and I heard him make those types of representations enough times that I simply assumed that one aspect of his background was that he had an Indigenous ancestry of some sort. Now, so for the member to say that he had no idea doesn't bear any credibility. I would submit that it's part of a pattern. This is a member who constantly says, very conveniently, he has no idea. He has no idea that his company falsely represented itself to be Indigenous owned, just as the member had no idea that his company was connected to a cocaine trafficker, just as the member said he had no idea about the text messages from Randy to his business partner implicated in a $500,000 fraud, just as the member says he has no idea about the arson at the company's warehouse. Mr. Speaker, on and on it goes. The minister's contention that he had no idea about the fact that his company tried to steal government contracts from legitimately owned Indigenous businesses has zero credibility. I would further observe that the minister, at the time that these bids were made and these false representations were made, the minister wasn't just anyone at the company. He was one of two partners at the company, and he was involved in the operations of the company on a day-to-day basis. This was, after all, before the member returned and was appointed to cabinet after the 2021 election. And as I noted, it seems very likely that, notwithstanding that he must not have, the member continued to be involved in the operations of the business, including potentially involving himself in matters of fraud while he sat in cabinet. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the minister come before committee to answer questions. The day that the minister resigned from cabinet happened to be the very day that he was scheduled to appear before the Ethics Committee. I have to say that I find it highly suspicious that the member resigned from cabinet on that very date. Mr. Speaker, the member, I also have to say, has been less than transparent when he has come before a committee. When he first appeared before committee, when allegations surrounding these text messages of a Randy, he claimed, and he had committee believe, that he had nothing to do with the company, nothing to do with the operations, nothing to do with communicating with Anderson, until further text messages revealed that this Randy was in Vancouver at the very same time that the minister was in Vancouver. And then he came back to committee and said, oh, actually, I did talk to my business partner, Anderson. Oops, I forgot to mention it. Mr. Speaker, that isn't just an omission, it is a material omission that amounts to misleading the committee. Mr. Speaker, the member for Edmonton Centre had better not hide behind the fact that he isn't in cabinet, because right now he is in hiding. No one has heard or seen from the member since he resigned from cabinet. He needs to come out of hiding. He needs to come to committee, and he must answer for his conduct involving this sordid and fraudulent matter. Thank you.
It is my duty and mon devoir d'interrompre maintenant les délibérations.
It is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put the question to the House. The question is as follows.
Moves that the 18th report of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs presented on Monday, November 25th, 2024, be concurred in. Amendment.
Amendment. Mr. Schmale, seconded by Mr. Cooper, moved the following amendment, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after that and substituting the following.
Monday, November 25th, 2024, be not now concurred in, but it be recommitted to the committee for further consideration with the instruction to report it back to the House no later than Monday, January 27, 2025, on whether the member for Edmonton Centre, who was the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages when the House adopted an order on Tuesday, November 19, 2024, requiring his attendance before that committee, has appeared in conformity with that order.
If a member participating in person wishes that the amendment be carried or carried on division, or if a member recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
À se lever et l'indiquer à la présidence. The honourable member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, we'd request a recorded vote, please.
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stand deferred until Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024, at the expiry of the time provided for oral questions. Lord, order in accordance with Standing Order 38, a motion to adjourn the House is deemed to have been made and seconded at this time. Therefore, the question is that this House do now adjourn. The honourable member for Mission Mascouy, Fraser Canyon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, I asked the Minister of Housing if he would join Conservatives in axing the federal GST on housing so that more Canadians could finally buy a home. Axing the federal GST would spark 30,000 new developments across the country per year. This tax cut will save $40,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments on an $800,000 house. Unfortunately, the Minister of Housing refuses to remove this burden from Canadian shoulders and still clings to a housing accelerator fund that doesn't build homes. The NDP Liberals Housing Accelerator Fund has failed Canadians. Toronto received $471 million and they increased development cost charges by more than $20,000. Ottawa received $176.3 million, and they increased development charges by between 11 and 12%. In my own hometown of Abbotsford, we received $25.6 million, and they increased development charges by 54%. And indeed, even in the letter they sent to Minister Fraser, to the Minister of Housing, after he requested a supportive letter from them, my own municipality could not tell the minister how many homes, in fact, have been built with the Housing Accelerator money they have received. Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate this government promised to lower rents, mortgages, and housing prices, but has instead doubled these costs for Canadians. Before the Prime Minister took power, it took 25 years to pay off a mortgage. Now it takes 25 years just to save up for a down payment. Things have gotten so bad that some families believe that they will never be able to pay off their mortgage, let alone get one. Only in Canada has housing become so unaffordable so quickly. Home prices are expected to once again break the records they set just recently. Between 25,000 and 35,000 people are homeless on any given night in Canada. 30% of Canadians who are homeless come from Indigenous communities. 22% of shelters are aimed at young homeless in Canada, while 20% of people experiencing homelessness are between the ages of 13 and 24 years of age. 88% of renters are saying that their goal of owning a home is out of reach, so much so that 28% of Canadians are considering moving to another country for greater affordability. Back in October 2015, a month before this Prime Minister took office, it only took 39% of the median pre-tax household income to cover home ownership costs. Now it's about 60%. While it used to be normal for working-class youth to buy homes, 80% of Canadians now tell pollsters that home ownership is only for the very rich. Removing the GST on new homes under $1 million would not only spark new developments across Canada, it would also remove a tax burden for new homeowners in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I listened with interest to the member, and he is a good member, and I know he cares a great deal about his community. He talks about families in his community and families across the country. What he doesn't mention is the Conservatives would, right away, if they were to assume office, cut child care support, which is now moved in many parts of the country to $10 a day, and where it's not at $10, it will soon be at that level, making life much more affordable. They would get rid of the school food program. We've seen tremendous progress on that. Recently, the provincial government on Ontario came together with the federal government. We've seen Manitoba move forward. We've seen Prince Edward Island move forward. What about support to help those living with diabetes? Free insulin, Mr. Speaker. They would get rid of that. And what they'd also do, to the point at hand, is get rid of support for housing. He talks about this big, bold idea, so-called, that the Leader of the Opposition has put forward to lift GST off of the purchase price of a home. How would they pay for that, Mr. Speaker? They would pay for it by getting rid of the Housing Accelerator Fund, which my friend, unfortunately, has not characterized correctly here today. I don't discount at all the importance of development charges. They are an impediment to getting more homes built, and municipalities have to find a way to lower as much as possible development charges. But what he doesn't talk about is the systemic changes that come as a result of this federal government attaching conditions to federal funding for municipalities so that, for example, zoning changes can become possible. Throughout too much of Canada's history, certainly into the modern day, we've seen certain types of homes, they're building anyway, outright illegal in this country. It's been outright illegal to build, in some neighborhoods, duplexes or triplexes or fourplexes, row houses, for example, mid-rise apartments. All of that would add tremendously to affordability to help the families in his community. Those young couples, for example, I especially have them on my mind, who have a tough time, if they can put together a down payment, finding a home that is